In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world still lies under a velvet shroud of darkness, history reveals its most unsettling truths. Empires rise to fanfare and triumph, but courts the chambers of kings and queens grow in silence. Behind carved wooden doors and tapestries woven with heroic scenes, another story unfolds hidden beneath layers of ceremony and devotion. It is the story of whispers, drifting through corridors of shadows, slipping past guarded thresholds of schemes shaped in the hush between two heartbeats. Here, in the courts of medieval Europe, power is not a crown of gold, but a blade without a sheath. Those who wear it bleed before they shine, and those who seek it step into a world where loyalty is measured not by love, but by usefulness, and where survival often demands a betrayal delivered with a steady hand. The chronicles that survived speak of battles, treaties, coronations grand, and public moments carved into stone. Yet behind every triumph lies a web of secret feuds, buried grudges, and cold ambitions. A glance exchanged across a banquet hall may decide the fate of a kingdom. A goblet lifted a step, misplaced, a message intercepted. All can shift the balance of power, tipping a dynasty into ruin. This journey leads into the dimly lit heart of that world. It wanders through the fading torchlight of royal chambers, through the smoky haze of feasts, where enemies sit elbow to elbow, through monasteries where inks darken parchment with coded warnings, and through castles where stairways curl like serpents around ambitions too large for any single lifetime. The tales you are about to step into are not legends polished by time. They are the darker bones of European history, restless, unembellished, and stained by the very hands that shaped the continent. Some wore crowns, some hid behind veils, some plotted from the sanctity of churches. All left footprints deep enough for us to follow centuries later. As you settle into this story, let the pace slow. Let the flicker of distant torches guide you. Let each chapter peel back a layer of silence from the courts that mastered the art of deception. And if you find yourself drawn into these shadows, into the secrets, the betrayals, the quiet rise and fall of dynasties, remember to like, share, and subscribe, so this journey through the hidden heart of medieval Europe can continue deeper, darker, and farther than ever before. The morning mist clung to the stone walls of castles scattered across medieval Europe, softening the edges of battlements and towers that had borne witness to generations of ambition, conquest, and treachery. In the quiet corridors, the scent of damp mortar and aged timber mingled with faint traces of yesterday's fire smoke, lingering like a ghost of past councils and clandestine gatherings. Outside, the first light of day hesitated against gray skies, illuminating flags that flapped listlessly over keep walls. Yet within these fortresses, another kind of light flickered, the glow of candle flames, trembling over carved wooden tables, and the shiver of whispered secrets that refused to sleep. These castles, palaces, and manor houses were more than dwellings. They were instruments of power. Each hall, each chamber, each spiral staircase was designed not only to impress and protect, but also to watch, to constrain, to remind its occupants of the precariousness of rank. In the heart of these strongholds sat the throne symbol of sovereignty, of dominion, of command, but also of vulnerability. For those who sat upon it were never free from fear. Every smile could hide a dagger, every friendly counsel a hidden snare. To rule was to navigate a web of allegiances enmities, and the unrelenting pulse of ambition that ran through the veins of every noble household. It was here, in these halls of stone and shadow, that the very nature of medieval kingship and queenship was forged. Young princes were taught that power was fragile, fleeting, and fought over, even within their own bloodline. Noblewomen learned early that influence could be as lethal as any sword wielded with a glance or a carefully placed word. Lords and vassals understood that loyalty could shift with opportunity, that favor was fragile and betrayal often closer than the hearth. The theater of the court was a stage upon which human desires, fears, and cunning played out with a clarity sharpened by survival itself. Outside the chambers of power, life in medieval towns and villages continued its rhythm. Fields plowed, markets opened, and bells tolled the hours. But within the walls of the castle, the pace of life was dictated by a different clock. The minutes ticked, not by sun or moon, but by the arrivals of messengers, the opening of council doors, the shifting alliances between influential households. Here, the pulse of history was measured in whispers, in clandestine meetings, behind tapestries, in hurried letters sealed with wax, each carrying the weight of consequences few would survive. Even in moments of apparent calm, the court was a living organism, a network of minds and ambitions intersecting and colliding in patterns invisible to those who only glimpsed the grandeur from without. Every hall was a study in contrasts. Banquets displayed opulence and excess, with tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, sweetened wines, and imported spices that spoke of distant lands. The laughter of courtiers might echo alongside the soft scratching of scribes recording alliances, debts, and debts of honor. Here, displays of loyalty and the subtle maneuvering of influence existed side by side, the glitter of gold masking the shadows of greed and vengeance. Every noble gesture could conceal a threat. Every ceremonial bow could mask contempt. Every toast could prelude betrayal. In the medieval court, appearances were as vital as swords and far more dangerous. And yet, despite the omnipresent tension, there was humanity. Fathers fretted over sons, untested in the complex currents of succession. Mothers counseled daughters in the silent arts of diplomacy. Advisors, ministers, and soldiers carried not only instructions, but the weight of conscience and the quiet fear of their own undoing. For in this world, mistakes were often fatal missteps, carried consequences beyond the individual, and the ambitions of one could unravel the lives of many. Shadows behind the throne were never idle. They whispered constantly, a symphony of caution, deceit, and the relentless desire to survive in a world ruled by blood and promise alike. The castles themselves seemed to breathe with history. Stone walls echoed with footsteps. Long-gone tapestries rustled with the memory of conversations never recorded, and staircases curved like the spirals of ambition itself. Each step upward, a journey toward power. Each step downward, a potential fall. Outside the gates, the land stretched in patchwork fields and forests seemingly peaceful. Yet each village, each market, and each river crossing was part of the larger story of controlled taxation and protection that fed the hierarchies within. To understand the court, one had to see both the interior and the world beyond, both the confined candlelit corridors and the vast open expanse of Europe itself. And it was within these corridors that the seeds of intrigue took root long before the world outside knew of the dangers within. Conversations held in the hush of twilight letters passed surreptitiously between trusted hands, and subtle gestures communicated threats and promises with precision. The throne was the ultimate prize, but attaining or maintaining it required navigating a labyrinth of loyalty, fear, and calculated risks. One misstep, a glance, a word, a hesitation could invite ruin, and yet ambition pushed forward, unrelenting, shaping the fates of families, kingdoms, and centuries. Here, in the early light, the court of medieval Europe began to stir. Footsteps echoed in corridors, as servants opened doors, as pages hurried with messages, and as lords and ladies assumed their roles in a drama that would unfold in whispers, schemes, and acts of courage and cruelty alike. Every ruler, every heir, every influential noble would face the same truth. Power was a promise, yes, but also a peril, and the shadows behind the throne were never empty. They were waiting, always waiting. As the day deepened, the castle's inner chambers revealed their true rhythm. The clang of iron gates closing behind incoming envoys echoed like a heartbeat through the stone halls, a reminder that the fortress was not only home, but a citadel of vigilance. Courtiers moved with purpose, their robes rustling over flagstones worn smooth by decades of passage. Every glance exchanged, every nod carried meaning. Alliances were affirmed, rivalries hinted at, loyalties tested. In this world, words could wound as sharply as swords, and silence often concealed the deadliest truths. In one dimly lit corner of the hall, a young page pressed a letter into the hand of a waiting chamberlain. The seal, marked with a symbol known only to the ruling family and their closest allies, suggested urgency. Outside the windows, the sun struggled to penetrate the morning haze, casting long shadows that slanted across the tapestries and shields decorating the walls. Within these silent moments, the machinery of court intrigue hummed steadily, invisible to any observer untrained in its subtle signals. Each step, each whisper, each seemingly idle observation contributed to a larger narrative of ambition, deception, and survival. The king, seated on a throne carved from oak and iron, surveyed his surroundings with eyes that had grown accustomed to calculating threats. Even among those sworn to him, he was never truly at ease. Faces masked motives, smiles disguised resentment, and familiar gestures could hide lethal intent. Years of training and experience had taught him that the crown was as much a burden as a privilege, a heavy weight of responsibility, tempered by the constant knowledge that it could be stolen or shattered in the space of a single misjudged moment. To rule meant to act decisively, to anticipate betrayal, and to measure the worth of trust with exacting care. Elsewhere in the twisting corridors that led to the private chambers of the queen and her council, women moved with their own intricate strategies. They were adept in arts, both subtle and profound, weaving influence through conversation, presence, and observation. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, names that would echo through history understood that power could be exerted without open confrontation. A glance at the right moment, a carefully phrased question, or the discreet presentation of a fact could shift the balance of court politics. They operated in shadows, yet their reach often extended farther than any knight's lance. In the kitchens below, cooks and stewards contributed to the theater of power. Tables groaned under the weight of roast and stew bread and pastries, wine and spiced mead. Each meal was not only nourishment, but a signal, a reflection of favor or disfavor. a subtle demonstration of wealth and capability. Poison, the silent accomplice, could be hidden in the folds of ceremonial feasts, the ambrosial taste of a sauce, masking the deadly intent of those who hungered for influence. Even in such domestic scenes, the potential for intrigue remained a constant reminder that danger often arrived under the guise of normalcy. Outside the castle walls, the countryside held its own stories of allegiance and unrest. Peasants tilled the soil, merchants carried wares along uneven roads, and soldiers trained in the fields beyond the keep. All were connected, if indirectly, to the delicate balance maintained within the stronghold. Every tax collected, every levy enforced, every decree issued from the throne influenced lives beyond the immediate gaze of the monarch. The crown's authority reached far, but it was fragile, dependent upon networks of loyalty that could fracture under pressure. The court's machinations were not isolated, they rippled outward, shaping the destiny of entire regions. The art of survival in this environment demanded not only courage, but cunning. Healers and apothecaries, long trusted for their knowledge of herbs and remedies, could just as easily be agents of silent death. Daggers disguised among ceremonial decorations or hidden beneath robes waited for moments when vigilance waned. Alliances seemingly steadfast could crumble overnight under pressure or promise of reward. Every decision, every maneuver carried consequences that were both immediate and lasting, and those who misjudged the tides of loyalty often disappeared into the annals of tragedy. Amid the tension, there were brief moments of humanity and reflection. A ruler might pause to consider the faces of children in the courtyard heirs whose future depended on both the protection of the crown and the wisdom of those who held it. A queen might linger at a window, contemplating the farmlands that sustained her people, aware that prosperity and loyalty were as fragile as the human heart. These fleeting instances did not erase the ever-present danger, they merely offered a counterpoint, a reminder that beneath the armor of ambition and the rituals of power were individuals bound by duty, affection, and fear alike. As dusk approached, torches were lit along the walls, casting flickering shadows that danced over armor and tapestries. The courtyard emptied, save for the occasional sentry, and the castle seemed to breathe a measured, expectant sigh. Within councils convened behind closed doors, debates murmured in candlelight, and plots advanced silently like a river under ice. Each figure, whether sovereign or servant, understood the stakes power was gained and maintained not only through might, but through foresight, calculation, and the delicate orchestration of influence. The throne was more than a seat, it was a stage, and every inhabitant a player in a drama as old as kingdoms themselves. In these moments of quiet tension, the lesson of the medieval court became clear. Survival depended on perception, as much as action on subtlety, as much as force. Every gesture, every exchange, and every secret held potential for triumph or downfall. The corridors whispered the stories of countless rulers who had learned these lessons too late, their names etched into memory as warnings. Power could illuminate or destroy. It could inspire loyalty or invite treachery. The shadows behind the throne were alive, patient, and eternal, watching, waiting, and shaping history with each unspoken move. By nightfall, the castle settled into an uneasy rhythm. Torches glowed, flickering against stone, casting long, moving silhouettes. The corridors, once bustling, were now a study in silence, punctuated only by the distant clatter of a sentry's armor or the soft creak of a turning key. And yet, within these silent passages, the pulse of intrigue continued, imperceptible to the untrained eye. The throne remained a symbol of ultimate authority and ultimate peril, and those who claimed it did so at a constant risk, aware that ambition, loyalty, and fear were inextricably intertwined. In the medieval court, every shadow told a story, and every story carried the weight of blood. The castle, which had felt alive with measured tension during the day, transformed at night into a stage of shadows and secrets. Candlelight flickered along stone walls, casting dark, shifting shapes that seemed almost sentient. Behind heavy doors and embroidered tapestries, whispered conversations carried weight. In these hours, the tools of subtle death poison, concealed blades, and silent alliances exercised a quiet dominion over kings and courtiers alike. Survival depended not only on courage, but on anticipation, the ability to read intentions in fleeting expressions, and to navigate the perilous currents of intrigue that flowed unseen. In the dim glow of a private chamber, an apothecary prepared a tincture. The mixture was unremarkable in appearance, a harmless liquid to the untrained eye, yet it possessed the power to end life with calculated precision. Medieval courts relied heavily on those who mastered such crafts, healers, alchemists, and apothecaries, figures both trusted and feared. They moved quietly, delivering remedies, preparing potions, and occasionally manipulating the outcomes of events that might determine the rise or fall of a ruler. In a world where a single misstep could mean death, their knowledge was a weapon as potent as any sword. Daggers, small and easily concealed, were prized companions in the pursuit of ambition. They were hidden beneath robes, within the folds of curtains, or even slipped into the intricate carvings of a ceremonial chair. Their existence was known to all, yet the danger was often underestimated. The element of surprise was paramount, and the history of medieval Europe is littered with tales of rulers and nobles who underestimated the reach of a hidden blade. In the quiet of a royal feast, a seemingly innocuous conversation could pivot on the balance between life and death, the air thick with tension and unspoken threats. Beyond the individual acts of assassination, the structure of the court itself fostered intrigue. Alliances shifted like sands in a storm. One day, a duke might swear fealty to the crown with solemn oaths. The next, he could be plotting its subversion in whispered meetings behind closed doors. Nobility and clergy alike participated in this delicate dance. Each gesture, an extended hand, a deferential bow, a well-timed compliment carried layers of meaning. Power was not merely inherited or commanded. It was earned, manipulated, and in the darker corners of the court sometimes stolen. The subtle science of poison demanded patience and an intimate knowledge of human physiology. Ingredients ranged from the innocuous-sounding to the horrifyingly potent extracts of hemlock nightshade and wolfsbane were carefully measured, their effects studied, and their application timed to perfection. A sip of wine, a morsel of cake, a seemingly casual touch of a hand could deliver death with such precision that suspicion often fell elsewhere. History remembers these acts, yet the silent work of an apothecary or a calculating noble often remained invisible, a ghostly hand shaping the course of kingdoms. Even within the seeming innocence of the banquet hall, the specter of death lingered. Servants moved in choreographed steps, unaware, at times, of the significance of their roles. Every dish placed upon the table could conceal intention. The atmosphere, rich with the aroma of spiced meats, roasted vegetables, and sweetened pastries, was deceptively mundane. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, subtle calculations of risk and reward unfolded. A mislaid cup, a hurried sip, a distracted glance, all could have fatal consequences, and all were part of the intricate tapestry of survival within these stone walls. Whispers were the currency of power. Messages, carried in hushed tones or through coded letters, could alter destinies. Courtiers learned to interpret pauses, glances, and the nuances of language. Information moved along invisible channels, sometimes reaching the throne too late, other times preempting decisions that could change the course of a reign. Secrets were both shield and weapon. Those who held them could manipulate events unseen, bending the will of kings and queens without ever stepping into the light. The shadowy networks of intrigue rivaled the reach of armies, their influence equally deadly. Night brought not only concealment, but also opportunity. The corridors darkened, and quiet became pathways for the ambitious and the fearful alike. A footstep, muffled by carpet or a stone floor, could carry someone closer to power or to death. Chambers, once bustling with council and ceremony, transformed into sanctuaries of plotting and whispering. Even trusted allies could be suspect. Loyalty was fragile, contingent upon circumstance, ambition, and fear. In the medieval court, trust was a currency often in deficit, and the consequences of misjudgment were eternal. In addition to the instruments of physical harm, psychological manipulation played a vital role in the silent games of the court. Fear was cultivated as carefully as loyalty. Rumors, half-truths, and insinuations seeded doubt, eroding confidence and fomenting paranoia. A king, unsure of his advisors, could be swayed by those who promised security or vengeance. Noble families leveraged scandal and accusation to unseat rivals, subtly shifting the balance of power without the drawing of swords. Strategy in these games required insight into human nature, a meticulous reading of character, and an unerring sense of timing. Yet amid these shadows, there were moments when the danger itself became spectacle. Public punishments, ritualized duels, and the display of disfavored courtiers served as warnings, reinforcing the precariousness of life at court. Death was ever present, a reminder of the consequences of missteps, both grand and small. Observing these rites, one could learn the intricate lessons of authority, how to wield fear without alienating allies, how to assert dominance while maintaining facade, and how to survive amidst a court constantly balancing ambition against loyalty. As dawn approached, the castle, which had witnessed countless acts of silent violence and whispered conspiracy, seemed to exhale. Torches burned low, casting flickering shadows along the stone walls. The courtiers, apothecaries, and spies retreated to their chambers, leaving the corridors empty, save for the occasional sentry. Yet the machinery of intrigue continued, invisible to the untrained eye, moving like an unseen river beneath the visible currents of daily life. The throne remained a beacon of ultimate authority and ultimate vulnerability, watched over by those willing to kill, deceive, and manipulate to claim it for themselves. In this environment, survival demanded mastery of both subtlety and observation. To navigate the medieval court was to understand the intricate interplay of trust, ambition, and fear. Every glance, every word, every gesture held potential meaning. A sip of wine might seal an alliance or deliver a silent death. A whispered message could protect a life or destroy it. The balance of power shifted continuously, often imperceptibly, yet with consequences that could alter kingdoms, topple dynasties, and carve legends into history. Here, in the shadows of the throne, the true game of survival began. The corridors of the castle remained hushed, yet the echoes of unseen scheming vibrated through every stone arch and vaulted ceiling. Even the simplest act, lighting a candle, arranging the royal bedchamber, delivering a meal, could carry hidden significance. Courtiers and servants alike navigated a delicate web, conscious that each step might intersect with a plot designed to shift the balance of power. In the medieval court routine itself was a stage for intrigue, and those who underestimated it often vanished from the historical record, their deaths unremarked, their betrayals unsung. At night, the royal kitchens became a theater of subtle danger. Healers and apothecaries moved among cauldrons and spice-laden shelves, preparing remedies that could heal or harm. Certain herbs were coveted not for flavor, but for their lethality. Hemlock nightshade and wolfsbane were introduced sparingly, their doses calculated to mimic illness or accident. A cup of wine served to the king could be an offering of loyalty or a silent death sentence. Each sip, each bite became a test of intuition, a gamble with life itself. The line between nourishment and assassination blurred, making every meal a potential turning point. Some plots required patience that spanned years. A single act of betrayal might be staged across multiple reigns, its origin hidden in the past, its execution contingent upon circumstance. Chroniclers often recorded the aftermath without understanding the intricate orchestration behind it. A sudden death here, a mysterious illness there, a conveniently timed disappearance. The artistry of slow, deliberate plotting demanded foresight and restraint. To act too soon was to risk exposure. To act too late was to lose opportunity. Power was held in balance, and patience was the unseen ally of ambition. While poison provided subtlety, the dagger offered immediacy. A carefully concealed blade allowed swift resolution, a decisive end without reliance on time or chance. Courtiers mastered the art of concealment, slipping daggers into sleeves, boots, or ceremonial garments. The act itself often required precision and courage. Proximity to the target demanded both skill and nerve. In a realm where appearances were everything, a sudden death could be masked as accident, illness, or divine judgment, and the perpetrator remained cloaked in secrecy. The dagger became both instrument and symbol, a silent testament to the dangers of proximity to power. Yet not all plots were solitary. Networks of conspirators operated in shadows, coordinated through coded messages, secret signals, and trusted intermediaries. Servants whispered warnings. Musicians carried notes hidden in sheet music, and scribes delivered letters veiled in allegory. Every participant assumed risk, yet the rewards could be monumental favor, power, or even survival. The interconnectedness of these clandestine operations revealed a court that was less a single hierarchy and more a complex, invisible lattice of influence and control. Understanding it required vigilance, intuition, and an unerring sense of timing. The unpredictability of human behavior added another layer to the courtly game. Loyalties shifted with rumor, fear, and ambition. Today's ally could become tomorrow's assassin. Today's friend could be tomorrow's betrayer. The king, ostensibly the pinnacle of authority, often remained the most vulnerable figure in the castle. Paranoia was a necessary companion. Suspicion, a tool of governance. Trust was scarce, and those who wielded it carelessly found themselves outmaneuvered. Success depended not only on strength, but on insight, on the ability to anticipate threats invisible to others. Some of the deadliest moments occurred in the guise of ceremony. Feasts, tournaments, and religious gatherings offered perfect cover. In these settings, poisons could be administered, daggers concealed, and plots enacted, while the court remained absorbed in spectacle. Courtiers and royals moved with ritualized grace, unaware that every gesture could be scrutinized for hidden meaning. In this environment, even the most mundane act, raising a goblet, accepting a gift, bowing in deference, carried potential consequences. The veneer of etiquette masked a perilous dance of life and death, one step away from tragedy at every turn. The psychological toll on rulers and courtiers was immense. Constant vigilance, a necessary skill for survival, bred suspicion and isolation. Alliances were fragile, friendships were strategic, and the line between loyalty and treachery was a daily consideration. Mental acuity became a survival skill as much as martial ability or political savvy. A king who failed to perceive subtle cues, an unusual glance, a hesitated phrase, a misplaced object, risked everything. The human mind became a battlefield as treacherous as any physical war, where mastery of perception could mean the difference between life and oblivion. Historical records are peppered with examples of both brilliance and folly in these silent games. Some plots were foiled by quick-thinking, clever deception or sheer luck. Others succeeded altering the course of dynasties, redrawing borders, and etching legacies into history. The consequences of a single poisoned goblet or a hidden dagger could echo across decades. And yet often, the human stories behind these acts remained partially obscured, glimpsed through letters, chroniclers' accounts, or whispered legend, reminding us that history itself is shaped not just by kings and armies, but by the unseen hands that orchestrated their fates. As dawn approached, the castle seemed to exhale. Shadows receded with the rising sun, and the halls filled again with the ordinary rhythms of governance council meetings, the ringing of bells, and the measured footsteps of servants. Yet beneath this surface, the machinery of silent plotting persisted, unseen but undiminished. The threats that had stalked the night did not vanish. They waited for the next opportunity, the next mistake, the next moment of human frailty. Life at court was a continuous balancing act, where awareness, cunning, and resolve determined not just survival, but supremacy. And so, in this hidden world of poisoned daggers and silent plots, power was both the prize and the peril. Kings and nobles alike navigated corridors lined with stone and suspicion, aware that a misstep could end their reign or their life. In the medieval court, the hand that fed you could just as easily strike you down. The smile of an ally might conceal intent, and the cup of wine meant to honor could just as easily bring death. Understanding this world requires an appreciation for the subtle, the patient, and the cunning, the forces that shaped empires without ever raising a sword in public view. Here, ambition and treachery were not merely tendencies, but necessities defining the very nature of survival. in a realm where silence could be deadlier than war. In the shadowed corridors of medieval Europe, the throne was never merely a seat. It was a symbol, a prize, and for many a temptation too great to resist. Ambition often overrode loyalty. Bloodlines became battlegrounds, and family ties were stretched to breaking point. To ascend to the crown, some kings did not hesitate to commit acts that would echo through history as treachery, fratricide, and cold-blooded calculation. Power demanded action, and in the brutal calculus of medieval succession, murder was sometimes the most expedient path to legitimacy. Richard III of England is perhaps the most infamous of these cases. The death of his young nephews Edward V and his brother in the Tower of London has become legend. A story of shadows, whispers, and unanswered questions. Historians debate what truly happened within those stone walls, but the consequence remains clear. Richard emerged as king, his ascent tainted by suspicion. The tower itself became a symbol of peril. Its walls bore witness to the vulnerability of even the most sheltered heirs. In medieval politics, proximity to power could be fatal, and the crown exacted a steep price from those who sought it. Across the Pyrenees, Peter the Cruel of Castile exemplified another form of blood-soaked ambition. Nicknamed for the ruthless efficiency with which he eliminated rivals and punished dissent, Peter's reign was a careful orchestration of fear. Every death reinforced his authority. Every execution a lesson to the nobility. Political opponents vanished quietly, often under the guise of rebellion or treason. And yet, in the retelling of history, Peter's actions became emblematic of a ruler who wielded terror as a tool. The lines between justice, vengeance, and power blurred in the flickering torchlight of his courts. Ivan IV, later known as Ivan the Terrible, represents a darker evolution of this theme in the early modern period. Yet his actions resonate deeply with the medieval psyche. The killing of his own son in a moment of rage, whether born from paranoia or personal conflict, demonstrates the lethal intersection of absolute power and human emotion. Ivan's example is a grim reminder in a world where monarchy is both divinely sanctioned and politically absolute. Personal fury could alter dynasties. Fear was not just a strategy, it was an instinct, a survival mechanism embedded within those who sat atop the throne. Ambition was rarely limited to a single act. Kings often orchestrated long campaigns of elimination, striking not merely at immediate rivals, but at anyone whose existence threatened the consolidation of authority. Cousins, uncles, and distant heirs were carefully watched. Their movements tracked, their allegiances tested. In many cases, the most dangerous adversaries were not foreign armies, but the very bloodlines that guaranteed succession. Thrones were fragile, and rulers learned early that vigilance within their own family could be as vital as defense against external enemies. Medieval Europe's political landscape created fertile ground for such acts. The feudal system, with its fragmented loyalties and decentralized power, meant that kings often faced challenges not only from nobility, but from their own kin. Alliances were fluid, marriages were strategic, and claims to the throne could be contested on the grounds of legitimacy, seniority, or sheer force. The tension between familial duty and political necessity forced rulers to make harrowing choices. In this environment, moral hesitation could be fatal. Indecision often invited rebellion, betrayal, or death. Consider the English Wars of the Roses, where familial bonds were repeatedly sacrificed on the altar of political necessity. Richard III's actions must be understood against this backdrop, a period in which the line between survival and treachery was perilously thin. The murder or disappearance of a relative was not merely personal. It was a statement, a calculated assertion of dominance meant to deter rivals and consolidate allegiance. In such a volatile climate, hesitation could invite challenge, and challenge often meant blood. Not every act of violence was successful or remembered in the same way. Some plots failed, resulting in the execution of the conspirators and further instability. Others succeeded so cleanly that the historical record preserves only a whisper of doubt. The calculus of murder as a political tool required a delicate balance, timing, discretion, and psychological insight. Understanding the motivations of these kings means seeing beyond their cruelty to the pragmatic realities of power, that sometimes survival, sometimes legitimacy, sometimes revenge, dictated choices that history condemns, but the circumstances demanded. The psychological dimension cannot be ignored. Kings who murdered to wear the crown were not merely cold strategists. They were men shaped by fear, ambition, and the weight of expectation. To assume a throne in medieval Europe was to enter a crucible where indecision could be fatal, where rivals could be hidden in plain sight, and where even the most trusted allies might betray. The act of killing was both instrument and shield, a necessary assertion of dominance in a world that respected strength above all else. The crown demanded ruthlessness, and history remembers those who delivered it. Across Europe, patterns emerge. From England to Castile, from the Italian city-states to the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, rulers confronted the same dilemma. Authority had to be asserted, challengers eliminated, and legitimacy reinforced. Yet the consequences of these acts extended far beyond the individuals involved. Each murder reshaped alliances, altered succession, and often provoked cycles of retaliation. Dynasties rose and fell on the edge of a dagger. History itself was written in blood and ambition. Despite the darkness, these stories are not merely cautionary tales of cruelty. They reveal the human stakes of governance in a fragmented and perilous world. A king's decision to eliminate a rival was rarely impulsive. It was a response to complex pressures: loyalty, fear, the expectations of subjects, and the unforgiving realities of medieval politics. In understanding these acts, we glimpse the precarious balance of power that defined the era. Each decision was fraught with danger, each action a potential pivot upon which the fate of kingdoms turned. And so, in examining the lives of these monarchs, one sees a continuum of ambition, fear, and survival. The throne was a magnet for desire and a crucible of morality. Blood was currency, and its expenditure was sometimes the only way to secure a fragile peace, a contested succession, or the preservation of the state itself. History remembers the kings who killed to ascend, but it also preserves a cautionary shadow that the pursuit of power is rarely clean, often perilous, and always intertwined with the human condition. Each death, each disappearance, each carefully concealed act of violence contributed to the architecture of power. To wear the crown was to inherit both authority and the specter of treachery. To ascend through murder was to understand the precarious and unforgiving logic of medieval monarchy. The lessons of ambition, ruthlessness, and the price of sovereignty are written indelibly across the annals of history, offering a window into the stark realities that governed Europe's medieval rulers. Beyond England and Castile, Europe is dotted with stories of rulers whose ascent to power was measured in lives extinguished. In the kingdoms of Scandinavia, succession often involved calculated eliminations within royal families where fratricide was grimly normalized. Sons could be sacrificed for the sake of stability, cousins executed to prevent rebellion, and regents removed when they threatened the young king's grip on authority. Each act of violence was a deliberate stroke in the broader canvas of political strategy, a testament to the ruthless pragmatism demanded by the medieval throne. Consider the Danish succession crises of the 12th and 13th centuries. Kings vied for authority in a landscape where dynastic legitimacy was both a shield and a target. Harold Kesha, for example, engaged in a campaign against his brothers, motivated by both ambition and the fear that fragmented leadership would invite external invasion. These conflicts were seldom discreet. Battles were fought in fields as well as in courts. Yet the killing of a rival, whether by sword or intrigue, was the ultimate assertion of dominion. For rulers in these northern realms, bloodshed was often inseparable from survival. In Italy, the patchwork of city-states and principalities produced rulers whose methods were no less severe. The Visconti of Milan, the Sforza who followed, and the Medici, as they ascended into power, all navigated labyrinthine family rivalries. Alliances shifted with alarming speed, and betrayal was a constant companion. When a prince or condottiero seized the throne, it was frequently through a combination of assassination, imprisonment, and calculated terror. The narratives of these rulers reveal a pattern consistent across the continent in the medieval pursuit of authority. Moral compromise was inevitable, and blood was the most liquid of currencies. Richard III's story, while infamous in England, resonates across these examples. The deaths of Edward V and his brother were not isolated incidents. They were part of a systemic pattern where heirs became obstacles. Contemporary chronicles and later historical analyses alike emphasize the ambiguity surrounding these murders. Was it pure ambition, political necessity, or both? The question itself underscores a critical aspect of medieval kingship: the intertwining of ethical judgment with survival instincts. The crown was a prize that demanded not only courage, but a willingness to commit acts that would later haunt memory and legend. Peter the Cruel of Castile similarly exemplifies the entanglement of political strategy and personal cruelty. His reign demonstrates that kingship was a theater where perception mattered as much as reality. By ruthlessly eliminating opponents, Peter projected an image of unassailable strength. Fear became a tool to enforce loyalty, and every execution was both punishment and performance. The line between political acumen and brutality was narrow, and for many rulers, the transition from one to the other was almost seamless. It is this duality, strategist and executioner, that defines the medieval tyrant. The consequences of these acts extended far beyond individual reigns. Each murder disrupted succession plans, forced alliances, and sometimes triggered retaliatory cycles that could engulf entire regions. When one prince fell by poison or blade, other claimants were compelled to react, often violently, to protect their own claims. Dynastic wars, whether localized or continent-spanning, were frequently rooted in these acts of internal bloodshed. History shows that one king's decision to eliminate a rival could set off decades of instability, reshaping borders and redefining political relationships. Yet while murder was a common tool, it was never a guarantee of security. Many rulers who acted with ruthless efficiency still faced revolt, betrayal, or premature death. The precariousness of their authority meant that vigilance was constant. The smallest oversight could lead to downfall. Richard III himself faced widespread opposition, and his rule, though marked by cunning, ended on the battlefield, demonstrating the limits of even the most calculated violence. Similarly, Peter the Cruel ultimately succumbed to rebellion, fueled in part by the fear and hatred his actions had inspired. The tension between legend and historical fact adds another layer of intrigue. Over time, stories of kings murdering relatives to ascend the throne became mythologized. Chroniclers, often with political motives of their own, dramatized events, portraying rulers as monsters or tragic figures depending on perspective. This interplay between history and narrative shapes our modern understanding. The line between reality and embellishment blurs, creating enduring tales that capture the imagination even centuries later. Such stories emphasize the dramatic, sometimes theatrical nature of medieval politics, where morality and necessity constantly collided. One recurring theme is the use of intermediaries. Kings often relied on advisors, mercenaries, and court officials to execute acts that could not be done openly. Healers might slip poison into wine knights, might deliver silent strokes under cover of night, and servants could become instruments of death without revealing the identity of their master. This delegation was both practical and strategic. It allowed rulers to maintain plausible deniability, preserving their legitimacy while achieving their ends. In this way, murder was systematized, becoming another facet of courtly administration. The psychological burden of these actions cannot be understated. To rule effectively often meant suppressing empathy in favor of pragmatism. Yet even the most calculated rulers experienced fear, paranoia, and guilt. Kings who killed to secure the throne had to navigate constant anxiety, watching for betrayal and anticipating plots. The throne, while a seat of power, was also a cage. Vigilance was unending, and trust a luxury few could afford. These dynamics underscore the human dimension of medieval tyranny behind every calculated move. Lay a complex interplay of ambition, fear, and survival instinct. He is strategist and murderer, visionary, and tyrant, feared and isolated. The pursuit of the crown is not merely a political journey, but a crucible of character, where every decision carries weighty consequences. In understanding these rulers, one gains insight into the structures and pressures of medieval society, a world where family loyalty was fragile, where the allure of power could override morality, and where the crown itself exacted an almost inhuman toll on those who sought it. As night falls over the stone battlements of Europe's castles, the legacy of these rulers is palpable. Empty corridors echo with whispers of plots and betrayals. Tapestries conceal secrets of ambition, and the shadows remind us that the pursuit of power often comes at the highest human cost. Kings who murdered to wear the crown did more than seize thrones. They shaped the destinies of nations, forged political traditions, and left stories that would haunt both history and imagination for centuries. The crown was both prize and curse, and those who reached for it did so, knowing that every ascent was written in blood. In the dimly lit halls of medieval castles, power was not solely the domain of kings. Behind tapestries and heavy oak doors, noblewomen observed calculated and sometimes orchestrated events that would shift the balance of kingdoms. Their influence was subtle, strategic, and often invisible to those outside the inner circle. Yet in a world where the sword and the scepter dictated authority, these women proved that intellect, patience, and daring could rival armies in their effectiveness. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most formidable figures of the 12th century, exemplifies this quiet but formidable power. Married first to Louis VII of France and then to Henry II of England, Eleanor's life was a testament to both the constraints and the possibilities of medieval queenship. She navigated court politics with shrewdness, supporting rebellions when they aligned with her interests, negotiating marriages to secure alliances, and using her extensive familial network to maintain influence over vast territories. Her presence was felt not only in her patronage of culture and the arts, but in the political machinations that shaped two kingdoms. The she-wolf of France. Isabella provides another vivid example. As queen consort to Edward II of England, Isabella faced a husband whose incompetence and favoritism threatened the stability of the realm. She maneuvered with precision, building alliances with discontented nobles and plotting to remove Edward from power. Ultimately, her audacious actions, culminating in Edward's deposition and the enthronement of her son Edward III, highlight the lethal combination of patience, strategy, and daring that characterized some of the most consequential female players in medieval politics. Isabella's story demonstrates that a woman's influence could be both personal and profoundly political. Reshaping the monarchy through careful orchestration. Margaret of Anjou, another queen whose legacy intertwines love, ambition, and blood, navigated the violent currents of the Wars of the Roses. Married to Henry VI, a king often described as weak and indecisive, Margaret assumed a central role in defending her husband's throne and the Lancastrian claim. She orchestrated military campaigns, negotiated with key allies, and made decisions that were sometimes ruthless, sometimes calculated for survival. In the annals of history, Margaret's actions were often judged harshly, labeled as ambitious or manipulative. Yet within the context of her era, her strategies were not only practical, but necessary in a court where indecision could invite death. These examples illuminate the broader pattern of female influence in the medieval courts. Noblewomen often operated in a world constrained by legal limitations, social expectations, and the physical dangers of palace intrigue. They were frequently tasked with securing dynastic continuity through marriage and childbearing. Yet they could also wield indirect authority through council mediation and covert action. Letters, coded messages, and carefully managed networks of loyalty allowed them to exert influence far beyond the visible confines of their courts. Their intelligence and foresight often determined the success or failure of entire dynasties. In some cases, women's power was exercised through subtle intimidation rather than overt action. A queen's presence in court could command attention, guide policy discussions, and create alliances simply by virtue of her position and reputation. Rumors, whispers, and reputation were as effective as any sword. The threat of exposure scandal or familial retribution could bend nobles to their will. By mastering perception and leveraging societal norms, These women navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics with a combination of skill and audacity. The tools at their disposal were varied: patronage of influential clerics, manipulation of marriage contracts, and management of household alliances all played a role in consolidating power. Some queens maintained private councils, trusted confidants, or networks of informants to gather intelligence on potential rivals. By staying informed, they could anticipate threats, preempt challenges, and react with calculated precision. Knowledge in many ways was their greatest weapon, sometimes more decisive than armies or legal decree. Yet the exercise of power came with peril. Queens and noblewomen faced threats not only from external enemies, but from within their own households. Betrayal was always possible as alliances shifted and loyalties faltered. A single misstep, an ill-timed comment, a poorly judged favor, or a revealed secret could lead to exile, imprisonment, or death. The stakes were constant, and the margin for error was minimal. These women learned to balance risk with opportunity, courage with caution, shaping the course of history while navigating a world that often underestimated their agency. In examining these figures, one observes the nuanced interplay between personal ambition and political necessity. Eleanor, Isabella, and Margaret were driven not merely by self-interest, but by the imperatives of dynastic survival and the protection of their children's inheritance. Their decisions, sometimes ruthless, were frequently calculated to ensure continuity and stability, albeit through methods that modern sensibilities may view as extreme. The shadowed corridors of power demanded both intellect and nerve, and these women possessed both in abundance. The legacy of these medieval queens extends far beyond their immediate political achievements. Their stories reveal the complexity of governance, the subtlety of influence, and the role of personality in shaping historical events. They challenge the assumption that military might and legal authority were the sole determinants of power. Instead, they demonstrate that strategy, perception, and adaptability could carve pathways to influence just as effectively as armies could conquer territories. Through their actions, they not only protected their interests, but actively molded the political landscape of Europe. Even within the ceremonial and ritualistic confines of court life, these women leveraged appearances and expectations to their advantage. Public gestures, participation in ceremonies, and the careful curation of image reinforced authority, while private counsel and negotiation ensured that their strategic objectives remained on course. This duality between public performance and private maneuvering was a hallmark of effective female power in the medieval period. Queens and noblewomen understood that perception could be as decisive as action, and they mastered the art of appearing compliant while pursuing complex agendas. As the sun sets over the stone walls of castles and palaces, the influence of these women becomes evident in the subtle shifts of power, the decisions of kings, and the outcomes of wars. Their presence, often invisible to chroniclers focused on male rulers, nonetheless shaped the trajectories of nations. In understanding their role, we gain insight into the hidden dimensions of medieval governance and the intricate strategies that sustained dynasties in an era of uncertainty and danger. These women were nurturers and strategists, diplomats and plotters, constrained by circumstance, yet empowered by intellect. Their lives illuminate the interplay between visible authority and hidden influence, revealing that Even in a world dominated by swords and crowns, intelligence, courage, and subtlety could alter the course of history in ways as significant as any battle. Beyond immediate political maneuvers, medieval queens and noblewomen often shaped the broader strategic landscape of Europe through marriages, regencies, and networks that spanned kingdoms. Each alliance carefully orchestrated, each betrothal meticulously planned, was a thread in the web of power that these women wove, often unseen, yet binding entire regions together or tearing them apart. Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughters, for example, became instruments of diplomacy, married into influential courts to secure alliances that bolstered her family's reach. The marriages were never casual. They were calculated investments in influence, ensuring that her lineage would extend into courts across the continent. Eleanor understood that dynastic strength was as much about the placement of daughters and sons as it was about land or armies. Through these carefully chosen unions, she extended her political leverage far beyond her immediate realm. Isabella of France's legacy demonstrates another facet of female agency: rebellion and forceful action when diplomacy failed. Her alliance with Roger Mortimer, her lover and co-conspirator, enabled her to challenge Edward II's misrule and manipulate the political structures of England. It was a move that balanced risk and reward, as Isabella leveraged both personal influence and political necessity to reshape a kingdom. In this, she exemplified a principle consistent among these women: the readiness to act decisively when circumstances demanded, often stepping into roles traditionally reserved for men. Margaret of Anjou's actions in the Wars of the Roses further illustrate the complexity of female influence. She was a queen consort thrust into the heart of a dynastic civil war. Her husband incapacitated the realm in disarray. Margaret assumed command, leading forces in battle, negotiating alliances, and rallying loyalists to the Lancastrian cause. Her leadership was not ceremonial. It was active, pragmatic, and at times ruthless. The challenges she faced, balancing loyalty, survival, and strategic necessity, highlight the precarious nature of power in a world where male-dominated military structures often overlooked women, yet depended on their cunning and judgment to survive. The influence of these women was not confined to immediate family or court politics. It extended into economic and cultural realms. Queens managed estates, oversaw revenues, and directed the production and distribution of resources that could bolster political power. Patronage of the arts and religious institutions further solidified their authority, crafting legacies that intertwined public perception with political maneuvering. Through these channels, noblewomen exerted soft power that, while intangible, was no less consequential than armies marching across borders. Intelligence and information were crucial to their influence. Letters, envoys, and networks of loyal intermediaries allowed these women to monitor developments across courts, kingdoms, and alliances. Knowledge was a currency as valuable as gold or land. They employed secret correspondence, coded messages, and trusted confidants to remain informed of plots, threats, and opportunities. In a period where communication could take weeks, this networked intelligence provided a strategic advantage, often tipping the balance in favor of those who wielded it most effectively. Yet power came with a delicate balance. Queens and noblewomen operated within a framework that could turn against them as quickly as it supported them. Betrayal, both real and perceived, was a constant threat. A misjudged alliance, a revealed secret, or a moment of overreach could lead to imprisonment, exile, or worse. Their strategies required patience, timing, and a constant readjustment to shifting political landscapes. The stakes were enormous, and the consequences of miscalculation were often deadly. The exercise of influence often involved psychological acuity as well. These women understood that perception could govern action as much as reality did. Demonstrating virtue, piety, or loyalty could mask strategic ambition. Subtle gestures, carefully chosen words, and controlled displays of emotion could sway powerful men and placate volatile nobles. In the theaters of courtly life where appearances and reputation mattered immensely, these techniques allowed women to wield power while maintaining a veneer of compliance. The interplay between personal ambition and familial duty was also critical. Queens and noblewomen were constantly negotiating the demands of personal survival, dynastic preservation, and political influence. Actions that strengthened one often risked undermining another. This intricate dance between roles as mothers, consorts, and political actors required intelligence, adaptability, and at times, ruthless decision-making. It is in this space, between the personal and the political, that the most consequential strategies were conceived and enacted. Historical narratives often downplay these women's contributions, focusing instead on the deeds of kings and generals. Yet the long shadow of their influence is evident in the outcomes of dynasties, wars, and treaties. By shaping alliances, directing resources, and managing perceptions, they influenced events in ways that could rival the impact of armies and legislative edicts. The subtle yet profound effect of their decisions rippled through centuries, leaving a mark on the political evolution of Europe. Even as chroniclers of the time often portrayed these women as manipulative or ambitious beyond their station, the evidence reveals a more nuanced reality. Their actions were often pragmatic responses to the structural limitations imposed by gender law and custom. By mastering diplomacy, intelligence, and familial strategy, they exercised agency within a system designed to constrain them. Their stories reveal both the possibilities and the limits of power for women in medieval Europe, highlighting the interplay between individual talent and systemic opportunity. Queens and noblewomen were indispensable actors in the political dramas of their time. Their influence, whether exerted through marriages, alliances, intelligence networks, or subtle psychological manipulation, was formidable. They could stabilize kingdoms, precipitate rebellions, or orchestrate shifts in power that reverberated across generations. Their stories remind us that power in all its forms often flows unseen, shaped by intellect, strategy, and the courage to act when the stakes are life and death. In reflecting on these narratives, one sees that medieval queenship and noble authority were far more than symbolic roles. These women were strategists, negotiators, and occasionally the unseen hands that guided the fate of nations. By examining their lives, the audience gains a richer understanding of the dynamics of medieval power, the subtle strategies that ensured survival, and the intelligence required to navigate a world in which every decision carried weighty consequences. Their legacy is a testament to the enduring influence of women who, through intellect and courage, left an indelible mark on history. The throne, a seat of authority and symbol of ultimate power, often became a stage for the most brutal of games. Succession in medieval Europe was rarely straightforward. Unlike the predictable rhythms of modern democracies, medieval inheritance laws were tangled, inconsistent, and fiercely contested. A king's death rarely passed smoothly to the eldest son. Often, It unleashed a maelstrom of ambition, jealousy, and fear. Entire kingdoms teetered on the delicate balance between legal precedent, personal ambition, and the raw exercise of force. Succession was both law and warfare, blood and negotiation entwined in an ever-shifting dance. The Anarchy. In 12th century England exemplifies this deadly complexity. When Henry I died without a legitimate male heir, his daughter Matilda claimed the throne, invoking legal right. Yet England was unprepared to accept a woman as sovereign. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, seized the opportunity. The kingdom fractured, nobles chose sides, and civil war erupted. Castles became fortresses of rebellion and loyalty alike. Towns were besieged, fields burned, and the countryside sank into fear and chaos. Every battle, every alliance, was a tactical move in a broader game whose rules were constantly rewritten by ambition, betrayal, and circumstance. Survival depended not only on strength of arms, but also on cunning foresight and the ability to navigate the treacherous waters of shifting loyalties. The Wars of the Roses, centuries later, would crystallize these patterns of succession into near-legendary complexity. The House of Lancaster and the House of York, both branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, contested the English throne for decades. Each side claimed legitimacy, each maneuvered through marriage, assassination, and open conflict. Battles were won and lost. Nobles switched allegiances like pieces on a chessboard, and the lives of ordinary people were caught in the crossfire. The throne itself, coveted and contested, became a magnet for both hope and despair. Here, the line between justice and cruelty blurred, and the pursuit of power revealed the sharpest edges of human ambition. In these struggles, kings and heirs learned that the family was both a foundation and a battleground. Brothers, cousins, and even fathers were potential rivals. Political calculation often demanded decisions that would seem unimaginable in ordinary life, imprisoning kin, exiling heirs, or resorting to execution. It was a world where affection was conditional, loyalty was fragile, and love could not protect a prince or princess from the knife of ambition. Ambition rarely respected bloodlines. Legitimacy was a tool as much as a right, wielded to justify action and condemn rivals. The personal was inseparable from the political, and survival demanded a keen understanding of both. Political marriages further complicated succession. Dynastic unions were rarely about love. They were contracts with the weight of kingdoms attached. Queens and noblewomen, as we explored earlier, played crucial roles in these arrangements, ensuring that alliances served strategic purposes. A well-timed marriage could consolidate claims, bring military support, or deter rivals. Conversely, a failed union could spark war, rebellion, or civil unrest. Each nuptial alliance was a calculated risk, and the lives of those involved were often secondary to the dynastic game. The stakes were nothing less than the crown itself. Power vacuums magnified the intensity of succession disputes. When a ruler died unexpectedly or without clear heirs, the ensuing chaos could engulf entire regions. Nobles exploited ambiguity, advancing their own claims or backing candidates whose favor they sought to secure. Regents, guardians, and influential courtiers could manipulate heirs, acting as puppet masters of fragile thrones. In such periods, castles and courts became theaters of intrigue, with every whisper potentially altering the course of history. The uncertainty was both perilous and opportunistic, inviting both audacity and treachery. The psychological toll on those involved was immense. Heirs lived under constant surveillance, aware that their claim could be challenged at any moment. They were trained from youth to navigate a world in which friends might be foes, advisors might betray, and even family could turn deadly. Paranoia was a survival mechanism, cunning a necessary skill. Those who underestimated the stakes often disappeared quietly, or not so quietly, from the corridors of power. In a world dominated by the sword and the law, a single misstep could spell death or disgrace. Chroniclers of the time, often attached to one faction or another, documented these events with both fascination and horror. Their accounts provide insight into the strategies, motivations, and human cost of succession struggles. They reveal a world in which legal theory met brute force, where bloodlines and battlefields intersected, and where every decision carried ramifications far beyond the immediate players. Understanding these conflicts requires seeing them not as isolated events, but as interconnected webs of ambition, loyalty, fear, and calculation. It is worth noting that succession disputes often transcended national borders. European dynasties were interconnected through marriage, fostering a complex network of obligations and rivalries that could ignite conflict across kingdoms. A claim in England might resonate in France. A rebellion in Castile could have repercussions in Aragon. These disputes were rarely contained, rippling outward through diplomacy, war, and intrigue, drawing neighboring powers into local disputes. The medieval world, while fragmented politically, was interconnected culturally and dynastically, making succession a concern that could alter the balance of power continent-wide. Amidst the turbulence, one constant remained the throne's magnetic pull. Every act of plotting alliance or battle was ultimately in service of gaining, defending, or controlling the crown. It was the ultimate prize, embodying legitimacy, wealth, and authority. Yet the path to the throne was perilous, demanding both shrewd strategy and ruthlessness. Few achieved it unscathed. Fewer retained it for long. In these contests, the crown was both goal and curse, offering grandeur and peril in equal measure. The game of succession also shaped institutions and governance. Laws were codified, courts were established, and military structures formalized to support claims and defend territories. Succession disputes prompted the evolution of feudal contracts, oaths of loyalty, and mechanisms for adjudicating claims. In essence, these bloody contests forged political structures that would endure beyond the immediate conflict, shaping the development of European monarchy for generations. From the ashes of chaos, governance emerged, albeit through trial by fire and blood. Even today, the stories of these succession conflicts capture the imagination because they reveal the timeless dynamics of ambition, strategy, and human frailty. They illustrate how power can corrupt, divide, and inspire, demonstrating that the quest for authority is as much psychological and relational as it is martial. The throne in all its splendor was always shadowed by danger, a constant reminder that in the medieval world, to claim power was to court peril. Every death, marriage, and battle was a calculated step in the broader strategy of survival and dominance. As succession disputes intensified, kingdoms became arenas of prolonged conflict, and the shadow of war stretched over every village, town, and castle. The stakes were immeasurable crown's lands, and the very survival of noble lines hung in the balance. Battles were fought not merely for personal glory, but to affirm legitimacy and secure the future of entire dynasties. Armies raised banners unfurled, and sieges ensued, while the hum of strategy and whispered plotting never ceased behind closed doors. Every victory or defeat reshaped alliances, and every casualty served as a stark reminder of the lethal cost of ambition. The Wars of the Roses in England offer a vivid tapestry of these deadly dynamics. Lancaster and York, both claiming the same royal blood, alternated between fleeting victories and crushing defeats. Nobles switched sides with careful calculation, guided by self-interest, promises of lands, or fear of retribution. Courtiers acted as advisors and spies alike, balancing loyalty with survival. For the common people, life was a precarious existence between competing armies. Villages were pillaged, harvests destroyed, and towns forced into submission. Amidst this turmoil, the throne itself was both prize and curse, promising authority while inviting constant danger. The psychological burden on heirs was immense. Young princes and princesses were groomed not merely in administration and warfare, but in vigilance, suspicion, and cunning. Every smile might mask deceit. Every handshake could conceal treachery. Familial bonds, the very foundation of legitimacy, were fragile in the face of ambition. Brothers, cousins, and even parents could be rivals, their loyalty contingent on circumstance rather than affection. Childhood lessons in strategy and survival often blurred into early adulthood, where naivety could lead to imprisonment, exile, or death. The stakes demanded relentless awareness and an unflinching mind. In many instances, succession crises were not only violent, but also prolonged. Years of negotiation, skirmishes, and sieges could exhaust kingdoms. Economies faltered, populations suffered famine and disease, and the fabric of society frayed under the weight of instability. During the Anarchy in England, chroniclers noted that neither Matilda nor Stephen could establish unchallenged control, leaving the countryside lawless and entire communities living in terror. Nobles exploited the disorder, fortifying castles, asserting independent authority, and extending influence at the expense of weakened monarchs. In these interludes of chaos, the lines between rebellion and survival were blurred. Marriage, as ever, remained a pivotal instrument in the succession game. Dynastic unions could seal alliances or spark new conflicts. Arranged marriages were meticulously calculated to cement claims, secure loyalty, or undermine rivals. Queens, often political actors in their own right, wielded significant influence over these arrangements. The union of strategic minds, combined with careful planning, could shift the balance of power between houses and sometimes between entire nations. Conversely, a failed marriage or betrayal could ignite wars that lasted decades, extending succession disputes into multiple generations. The brutality of succession disputes was often compounded by propaganda, rumors, and strategic misinformation. Chroniclers loyal to one house vilified opponents, spreading tales of illegitimacy, cruelty, or incompetence. Heralds and messengers carried selective accounts of victories, exaggerating triumphs and masking defeats. Even religious figures could be drawn into the narrative, blessing some claims while condemning others. The medieval court, therefore, was not only a stage for armies, but also for perception, reputation, and the careful construction of authority. The power to control the story was as vital as the power to wield a sword. Consider the example of Richard III and the contested succession that haunted the English crown. The disappearance of his nephews in the Tower of London became a symbol of the extremes to which claimants might go. Whether through ambition, fear, or political calculation, the act transformed public perception, embedding suspicion and rumor into history. Similarly, Peter the Cruel of Castile asserted his claim through a combination of martial prowess and ruthlessness, demonstrating that legitimacy alone was insufficient without decisive action. Each claim, each action left a trail of loyalty, betrayal, and blood that defined the era. Succession disputes were not confined to England. Across Europe, similar patterns unfolded. In France, the Capetian and Valois dynasties faced recurring crises as heirs, sometimes minor children, were thrust into power amid contested claims. The fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire created multiple centers of influence, each with its own succession laws, customs, and ambitions. In Castile and Aragon, rival claimants sought to consolidate authority through warfare, diplomacy, and strategic marriage. Across kingdoms, succession crises shaped not only political maps, but also cultural memory, with stories of intrigue and violence immortalized in chronicles, poems, and later histories. Yet even amid bloodshed, a strange form of order emerged. Medieval rulers and nobles developed codes of conduct, sometimes formalized in treaties, oaths, or feudal obligations to manage succession conflicts. Battles were fought according to strategy. Castles sieged with precision, and diplomacy continuously adjusted the balance of power. Alliances once forged could hold or crumble based on calculated risk. In these rules and customs, medieval society sought to impose predictability on the inherently unpredictable pursuit of power. Even the most ruthless acts were often governed by a framework, however fragile. Ultimately, succession in medieval Europe was a relentless interplay of ambition, loyalty, strategy, and survival. Thrones were never inherited passively. They were claimed, defended, and contested with all the tools available: swords, diplomacy, marriages, and intrigue. The human cost was immense, yet these struggles also forged political structures, defined dynasties, and shaped the course of nations. The pursuit of the crown revealed the extremes of human behavior, where love and betrayal, courage and cruelty, justice and ambition coexisted in a delicate, often deadly balance. It was a game played at the highest stakes, with consequences that rippled through generations. Every decision carried profound weight, every alliance a potential trap, and every claim a call to arms. The stage is set for our next chapter, which will explore the intensely personal betrayals and fraternal conflicts that brought even families into the deadly theater of medieval power, illustrating that in this world, the closest bonds could be the most dangerous. Within the towering stone walls of medieval castles and the sprawling courts of Europe, family was never merely family. Bloodlines promised legitimacy and continuity, yet they also bore the seeds of rivalry, envy, and lethal ambition. The medieval world revered kinship as sacred, but the harsh reality of succession often turned brothers, cousins, and even fathers and sons into adversaries. Every smile could mask malice. Every embrace might conceal treachery, and every whispered counsel had the potential to orchestrate another demise. The intimate connections of royal families were paradoxically the most dangerous. In the silent corridors of power brothers, eyed each other with suspicion. Eldest sons, heirs by right, lived under the constant shadow of ambitious siblings. Younger sons denied immediate authority, nurtured impatience, and a thirst for recognition that could erupt in revolt or secret schemes. Princes, trained in horsemanship strategy and court etiquette, were equally schooled in political cunning, learning to read gestures, detect subtle shifts in loyalty, and anticipate betrayal before it struck. Childhood lessons in obedience and deference often became exercises in careful observation and strategic self-preservation. Among the most infamous examples is the tale of the English royal siblings during the 15th century. The ducal families of York and Lancaster illustrate how fraternal bonds could become perilous. Rivalries were exacerbated by competing claims to the crown, creating a delicate web of shifting alliances. In some cases, a brother might be imprisoned under orders from another forced to submit to humiliating oaths or compelled to relinquish lands that were once his inheritance. In others, the threat of assassination or a sudden ambush loomed. The corridors of castles were silent witnesses to plotting whispered betrayals, and the quiet calculations of men who were both kin and competitor. Pressure to consolidate power amplified tension within families. Lords and princes were constantly reminded that indecision could be fatal. Ambitious younger siblings, guided by clever advisors or driven by personal grudge, sometimes aligned with discontented nobles or foreign powers to challenge their kin. Letters carried in secret coded messages hidden within gifts and clandestine meetings became instruments of plotting. Betrayal among brothers was rarely impulsive. It was deliberate, strategic, and chillingly methodical. The stakes were not just land or titles, but survival itself. Consider the tragic story of Ivan the Terrible, whose rage and insecurity culminated in the ultimate act of familial destruction, the accidental killing of his own son. In this instance, fierce suspicion and a volatile temper converged to transform paternal authority into lethal menace. It was a grim reminder that in the crucible of medieval power, even those entrusted with protection and care could become agents of violence. The consequences reverberated far beyond the immediate family, destabilizing alliances and sowing distrust throughout the court and among vassals. Sibling rivalry was also intertwined with the ambitions of the extended court. Nobles and counselors often exploited familial tensions, encouraging discord to gain influence or eliminate rivals. Trusted advisors could act as double agents offering counsel while subtly undermining one sibling in favor of another. Marriage's gifts and favors were calibrated not only to secure loyalty, but to manipulate perceptions of threat and opportunity. In this environment, trust was fragile, loyalty was conditional, and survival required constant vigilance. The psychological dimension of fraternal conflict cannot be overstated. Princes and dukes grew up knowing that affection could coexist with mortal danger. They internalized lessons of mistrust, caution, and strategic patience. Decisions had to be weighed carefully. A single misstep could lead to exile, imprisonment, or death. The court became a stage for intricate games of perception, where a gesture, a glance, or a seemingly casual remark could carry the weight of threat. Ambition and kinship were locked in a perpetual dance, choreographed by centuries of custom, expectation, and political necessity. Yet betrayal among brothers was not merely the product of ambition. It was also fueled by the rigid hierarchy and the scarcity of power in a world where only one could wear the crown. In families with multiple heirs, limited resources, and competing claims created natural friction. Titles, lands, and privileges were finite. The firstborn often received the lion's share, leaving younger siblings to navigate a precarious path. Frustration, envy, and a sense of injustice could ferment into rebellion, sometimes manifesting in open warfare or covert assassination plots. Every family was a potential theater of conflict. Historical accounts show a recurring pattern. Family members could be both protectors and predators. Young princes were educated alongside cousins who might later be rivals, while siblings were raised with both loyalty and wariness as twin guiding principles. Alliances formed within families were as fluid as those outside. Brothers could unite against a common enemy one moment and turn on each other the next, their fates dictated by the evolving political landscape. In these tense environments, survival demanded not only courage, but also cunning and foresight. The human cost of fraternal betrayal was immense. Entire dynasties could be destabilized by a single act of violence within the family. Battles sparked by internal disputes claimed countless lives, from soldiers to civilians caught in the crossfire. Castles and towns became fortresses under siege, not only from external threats, but from internal rivalry. The chroniclers of the era, with meticulous attention to detail, documented betrayals, duels, imprisonments, and executions, leaving a rich yet grim record of how ambition and bloodlines intertwined. These accounts reveal a medieval world in which love, loyalty, and life itself were often subordinate to the pursuit of power. In many cases, such betrayals shaped the trajectory of nations. A brother who survived or triumphed could consolidate power, bringing a period of stability, while a family torn by conflict could plunge a kingdom into chaos. The ripple effects of fraternal enmity extended beyond the immediate court, affecting diplomatic relations, alliances, and succession policies. Wars triggered by family disputes could endure for decades, drawing in foreign powers and reshaping borders. The intimate betrayal of blood relatives became inseparable from the broader story of medieval politics. Brothers, the nearest of kin, could become the most formidable enemies. The line between love and murder blurred, and every gesture, every decision carried potential peril. With the stage set by familial rivalry, the next part will delve deeper into secret alliances, hidden schemes, and the lethal strategies that siblings employed to outmaneuver one another, exposing the dark heart of medieval dynastic ambition. The shadows of ambition in medieval courts often manifested most ruthlessly among brothers. The annals of Europe are lined with stories of princes who schemed, imprisoned, or assassinated their siblings, seeking to secure a fragile claim to the throne. In France, the Capetian dynasty was a fertile ground for such tensions. Younger sons, often excluded from immediate inheritance, nurtured resentment while plotting alliances with discontented nobles. Some would feign loyalty only to strike at the opportune moment, while others moved in the night with daggers hidden beneath their sleeves or letters smuggled to conspirators. One chilling illustration comes from the Wars of the Roses in England. Edward IV's brothers, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, navigated a court rife with suspicion and shifting loyalties. George's ambition, manipulated by cunning advisors, led him into plots that ultimately ended in execution, while Richard's calculated maneuvering elevated him to kingship as Richard III. The intricate web of familial betrayal, here demonstrates a brutal truth in the pursuit of power. Even blood could be weaponized. Allies and enemies were sometimes distinguished only by whose hand wielded the dagger first. In other realms, the stakes were no less lethal. The Byzantine Empire, with its opulent but perilous palaces, offers stark examples of fraternal rivalry turned murderous. Princes plotted with eunuchs, generals, and courtiers to overthrow one another. When a younger sibling's claim threatened the emperor, he might be confined to monastic life, blinded, or quietly executed. Imperial brothers learned early that visibility in court could be fatal. The line between attending a feast and attending one's own funeral was dangerously thin. Not all betrayals ended in outright death, though the consequences were still severe. Exile and imprisonment were common tools for neutralizing rivals within the family. A brother might be stripped of titles, lands, and wealth, forced into obscurity, while the reigning sibling consolidated power. Such punitive measures ensured immediate security, but often left lingering resentment. Displaced princes became symbols for opposition factions, and years of careful plotting could culminate in rebellions or civil wars that engulfed entire kingdoms. Here, fraternal betrayal became the catalyst for broader instability, demonstrating the far-reaching implications of private ambition. The psychological toll on both victim and perpetrator was profound. Princes lived under the constant tension of dual realities, the warmth of familial bonds and the lethal potential of those same relationships. Many were haunted by suspicion, paranoia, and fear, while others hardened themselves, suppressing empathy to survive. Chroniclers of the time describe moments of apparent brotherly intimacy, shared hunting expeditions, joint military campaigns, public displays of loyalty that concealed a simmering undercurrent of rivalry. Each conversation, glance, and gesture carried latent meaning. Every smile could mask the readiness to strike. Sometimes, fraternal conflict escalated into public spectacle. The brutal rivalry between John of Gaunt's sons in England or between French royal siblings could ignite open warfare. Armies, loyal to rival brothers, clashed in fields stained with blood, and castles became fortified prisons for the vanquished. These conflicts were often prolonged, draining the treasury, destabilizing borders, and leaving civilian populations to endure famine, displacement, and violence. In such wars, the personal grievances of royal brothers had national consequences, transforming intimate rivalry into catastrophe for entire kingdoms. Yet even amid treachery and bloodshed, the bonds of brotherhood could unexpectedly resurface. Alliances were formed when external threats demanded unity, revealing the malleable nature of loyalty. Brothers who had once been bitter rivals might set aside differences to repel foreign invaders or to counter the ambitions of rebellious nobles. Such temporary reconciliations were pragmatic rather than sentimental, demonstrating that even in medieval courts, survival often depended on a careful balance between rivalry and cooperation. The chronicled strategies of these fraternal betrayals were as varied as they were cunning. Poisoned wine concealed daggers, orchestrated ambushes, and secret correspondence all played roles in reshaping dynasties. Advisors, loyal knights, and even servants could be co-opted into plots amplifying the reach and subtlety of betrayal. Success required not just audacity, but meticulous planning, foresight, and psychological acumen. A miscalculation could prove fatal. A misjudged loyalty or a delayed strike might result in imprisonment, mutilation, or execution. In this deadly calculus, power was inseparable from fear. Some of history's most infamous cases demonstrate the extremes of fraternal treachery. The mysterious fate of the princes in the Tower under Richard III illustrates the terrifying possibilities when ambition and opportunity intersect. The young Edward V and his brother Richard were removed from public view, their ultimate fate shrouded in speculation. This historical ambiguity has fueled centuries of debate showing how fraternal betrayal not only altered immediate succession, but also left enduring mysteries that continue to fascinate historians and the public alike. Across Europe, from England to Castile, from Byzantium to the fragmented principalities of Germany and Italy, the theme repeats, brothers, bound by blood, yet divided by ambition, shaped the medieval political landscape through acts of cunning coercion and cruelty. Every court had its share of secret conspiracies and hidden alliances. Every royal sibling had to navigate the treacherous waters of family loyalty, noble influence, and public perception. In this world, survival required constant vigilance, a readiness to strike, and the ability to anticipate both human frailty and malice. Sibling rivalry was not a private matter. It was a driving force of political strategy, dynastic continuity, and national destiny. From whispered threats in shadowed corridors to open warfare across fields and towns, brothers shaped the fate of kingdoms. Each story of betrayal reinforces a chilling truth. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and the desire for power often eclipses the bonds of family, leaving a legacy defined by both ambition and horror. In medieval Europe, religion was never just a matter of faith. It was a potent instrument of power, a double-edged sword wielded with precision in courts across the continent. The church stood not merely as spiritual guide, but as an omnipresent political force capable of exalting kings or toppling them with equal ease. Archbishops, cardinals, and even humble parish priests operated within a framework where divine authority and temporal ambition intersected, and the line between sacred duty and political calculation was often blurred. In this arena, holy men and women became architects of intrigue, and the church's blessings or curses could be as deadly as any sword. Few episodes capture this perilous nexus as vividly as the assassination of Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. Once a close confidant and chancellor to King Henry II of England, Becket had become a formidable adversary when he defended the church's independence. Chroniclers recount how the king's frustration, whispered remarks, and veiled threats, possibly taken literally by 4 knights, culminated in a violent act that shocked Europe. Within the sacred walls, the clash of spiritual authority and royal power exploded in blood, leaving the cathedral not merely a place of worship, but a grim theater of political consequence. The martyrdom of Becket illustrates how ecclesiastical figures could wield moral authority that transcended temporal borders, yet also risked mortal peril when entangled with monarchy. Excommunication. Another weapon in the church's arsenal could paralyze entire realms. To be cut off from the sacraments was to face social ostracism, spiritual terror, and political vulnerability. Popes and bishops employed excommunication not merely as a spiritual sanction, but as leverage in disputes over succession, taxation, or territorial claims. Kings feared the weight of the church's disapproval as much as they feared armed rebellion for an excommunicated ruler could find noble allies abandoning him and the populace questioning his legitimacy. In this way, holy authority became inseparable from political machinations, creating a silent yet omnipotent battleground where allegiances could shift overnight. Marriage, too, became a domain where religious authority and palace intrigue entwined. The annulment of unions, the imposition of papal dispensations, and the orchestration of dynastic marriages allowed monarchs to consolidate power, but always under the watchful eye of the church. Disputes over legitimacy, whether a child was rightful or bastardy, could determine the succession of kingdoms, often led to prolonged conflict. In France, England, and Spain, queens and princesses became instruments of diplomacy and power. Yet their fates were often inseparable from clerical decrees. The church could sanctify or sabotage a union with equal gravity, turning matrimonial arrangements into potential catalysts for rebellion, exile, or assassination. Beneath the surface, the interplay of holy influence and courtly ambition was a labyrinth of subtle gestures and calculated risk. Clerics could serve as intermediaries between rival factions, transmitting secret messages, crafting treaties, or endorsing coups. Their loyalty, however, was never guaranteed. Allegiances were mutable, shifting as political winds changed. A bishop might secretly correspond with a rebellious noble while outwardly performing pious ceremonies in the king's chapel. In such circumstances, the sacred and the profane merged seamlessly, and the corridors of power echoed with whispered confessions that could determine the life or death of a kingdom. Consider the role of monasteries and abbeys in intelligence and intrigue. These religious institutions, often geographically remote, yet politically influential, became centers of communication and sanctuary. Monks chronicled events, preserved documents, and occasionally facilitated covert operations. Their libraries contained not only theological texts, but also accounts of land holdings, legal disputes, and genealogies, information of immense value to rulers plotting to consolidate or contest power. The scriptorium was a hub where knowledge was currency, and scribes could be unwitting accomplices in schemes that would ripple through courts and battlefields alike. Assassination, within the framework of religious authority, presented a paradox. Murder in a sacred setting was both a sacrilege and a political statement. Princes, nobles, and even clerics themselves became targets in contests where holy sanction and political expediency intertwined. A well-placed sword in the shadow of an altar could remove a rival, enforce a decree, or settle a succession dispute, yet the perpetrators risked eternal damnation and social outrage. These acts of holy murder, chronicled in annals and ballads, underscore a grim reality: faith could be wielded as a weapon, and the sanctity of the church was not immune to the ambitions of men. Even when violence did not occur, the threat alone could manipulate behavior. A king or noble who feared ecclesiastical censure might temper policies, delay campaigns, or negotiate with rivals he would otherwise have crushed. The church's pervasive influence extended beyond legal or spiritual realms. It shaped strategy, diplomacy, and the psyche of rulers. Holy sanction, excommunication, and papal mandates became as strategically significant as armies and fortifications, turning the moral authority of the church into an invisible but formidable weapon of statecraft. One notable example is the political engagement of Pope Innocent III, whose tenure illustrates the Church's capacity to orchestrate continental influence. By intervening in succession disputes, calling crusades, and asserting papal primacy, Innocent III demonstrated that religious authority could rival the might of kingdoms. Monarchs negotiated, cowered, or conspired under the shadow of his influence. Papal legates moved across courts, sometimes acting as emissaries of diplomacy, at other times as agents of subtle coercion. The Church's reach, thus, was both pervasive and intimate, able to dictate the contours of ambition and temper the consequences of betrayal. Amidst this backdrop, holy figures were not merely passive observers, they were active participants in palace intrigue. Bishops, abbots, and cardinals cultivated networks of loyalty and espionage, monitoring noble houses and reporting to higher authority. Their counsel could sway kings, shield conspirators, or expose treasonous plots. Religious institutions, with their wealth and literacy, were both sanctuaries and strategic centers, turning prayers and rituals into instruments of political influence. In this world, the sacred was inseparable from the secular, and holy men navigated the delicate balance between spiritual guidance and mortal power. Its influence could legitimize rulers, protect innocence, and maintain order, or it could incite fear, manipulate succession, and sanction murder. Holy authority was a force to be reckoned with, a silent partner in the deadly dance of palace intrigue. In every whispered prayer, every excommunication, and every clandestine correspondence, one sees the indelible mark of religion upon the deadly politics of the medieval throne. The corridors of power, illuminated by candlelight and shadowed by ambition, reveal a complex tapestry where divine will and human ambition were often inseparable. The shadow of the Church stretched over every throne, every council, every banquet, where decisions of life and death were made. Beyond Thomas Becket, countless rulers and nobles learned that the spiritual authority of Rome could be wielded as a sword sharper than steel, cutting through alliances, legitimacy, and power. Excommunication was not merely a sentence. It was a political instrument capable of unraveling kingdoms from within. Kings and emperors knew that defying the Church meant isolation, rebellion, or worse, being remembered not as a ruler, but as a heretic, undone by the very faith that had once crowned them. The murder of Becket became both cautionary tale and enduring legend. Pilgrims flocked to Canterbury to witness the martyr's tomb, but the political consequences rippled far beyond England. Henry II, though spared immediate rebellion, had been humiliated on a stage crafted by faith and ritual. The king's authority remained intact, yet he had been reminded publicly and irrevocably that spiritual power could rival martial force. Across Europe, rulers began to measure their ambitions against the subtle reach of clerical influence, and courts became places where priests and prelates could decide the fate of emperors without ever lifting a sword. Papal interference in royal succession often transformed dynastic disputes into continental crises. In Castile, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, popes issued dispensations, recognized heirs, and annulled marriages, reshaping the political map with ink and decree. Disputes over legitimacy, whether of kings or princes, could escalate into civil war, all sanctioned or forestalled by the blessing or condemnation of a single pontiff. To secure loyalty, monarchs cultivated relationships with influential bishops and cardinals, offering land, gold, and favors. Conversely, those who ignored these spiritual intermediaries risked excommunication or covert rebellion supported by discontented nobles. Within this intricate web, religious authority and secular ambition merged into a single potent force. In the shadows of cathedral vaults, correspondence between church officials and court conspirators often dictated the course of politics. Monks, abbots, and clerics carried coded letters, negotiated secret alliances, and orchestrated interventions under the guise of diplomacy. A single missive could prompt a noble to revolt, convince a king to reconsider a treaty, or reveal a plot before it could unfold. Spies within the monasteries and cathedral schools reported on court intrigues interpreting the behaviors of princes and prelates alike. This interplay of surveillance and confession transformed religious institutions into both sanctuary and intelligence network. The marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter Joan to the King of Sicily offers a striking illustration of church-driven political maneuvering. Papal approval was required, and the Pope leveraged his consent to extract concessions from the French crown. Every ecclesiastical blessing came at a cost. Every spiritual sanction could reshape alliances across kingdoms. In similar fashion, Isabella of France, the so-called she-wolf, maneuvered with clerical support to depose Edward II of England through a combination of diplomacy, strategic alliances, and tacit ecclesiastical approval. She orchestrated a coup that entwined marriage, religion, and assassination in ways that would haunt English politics for decades. The power of the Church extended even into the mechanics of assassination and intrigue. Clerics might provide poisons, conceal weapons, or lend legitimacy to actions otherwise deemed treasonous. In some courts, alchemists and healers, often attached to ecclesiastical households, developed substances and rituals that could be deadly or manipulative. In Italy and France, noble houses consulted bishops and monks alike for advice on how to neutralize rivals, while remaining in the eyes of God blameless, or at least unproven. Sacred knowledge and political calculation converged, demonstrating that faith itself could be weaponized in the hands of the ambitious. The case of Pope Boniface VIII illustrates the potential for direct confrontation with rulers. Boniface clashed with Philip IV of France, asserting papal authority over taxation and law, culminating in the infamous outrage at Anarchy, where the Pope was physically seized and humiliated. Though he was released, Boniface's death, shortly after, was widely interpreted as divine retribution and political consequence intertwined. Such events highlighted the precarious balance between ecclesiastical might and royal ambition, reminding all that even the Pope, seated atop the Church's hierarchy, could not command immunity from earthly plots or human brutality. Monastic chronicles of the period provide another lens into these dark intersections of faith and power. Chronicles from Cluny, Monte Cassino, and Westminster Abbey record not only theological matters, but the political intrigues that surrounded abbeys and cathedrals. Monks detailed clandestine meetings, clandestine correspondence, and even murders that occurred within the walls of religious institutions. These narratives, while sometimes hagiographic, reveal the extraordinary degree to which clerics participated in, or at least observed, the lethal games of throne and crown. Religious houses were sanctuaries, but also theaters for intrigue, their hallowed halls echoing with both prayer and conspiracy. The Church also wielded influence through symbolic displays of power. Coronations, processions, and the public pronouncement of sanctions were all tools to reinforce authority. A king paraded before his subjects with the Church's blessing could intimidate rivals and galvanize loyalty. Conversely, a ruler publicly shamed, excommunicated, or denied communion could find his court divided and his enemies emboldened. Ritual in this sense was as deadly as a dagger. Every ceremony carried a political payload, every mass a potential verdict on the stability of a dynasty. By the end of this era, the pervasive entanglement of spiritual and temporal authority had left its mark. Courts were as much arenas of ecclesiastical maneuvering as they were of martial planning. A successful ruler needed not only soldiers but allies within the church. A survival instinct intertwined with devoutness could dictate whether a king thrived or fell. And in this shadowy world, where excommunication and assassination could coexist, it became clear that the corridors of power were never free from the influence of holy hands, nor from the blood that often flowed beneath them. Sacred rituals, excommunications, and the influence of clerics shaped history as decisively as battles and sieges. The intricate dance of faith and politics of prayers whispered and secrets hidden created a world where divine sanction and mortal ambition intertwined, and where the consequences of defiance were often fatal. In every whispered council and every solemn mass, the church left its indelible mark upon the deadly theater of medieval power. The castle, long a symbol of protection and authority, could just as easily become a prison for its lord. Behind towering stone walls, within the echoing halls of opulent chambers, ambition simmered. The very place meant to safeguard the ruler often incubated betrayal. As power-hungry courtiers, ambitious generals, and disaffected family members plotted in silence. Every corridor, every spiral staircase, every chamber could conceal eyes, ears, and blades. The heart of the castle, its throne room, the king's private chambers, and the inner sanctum was also the theater of the most intimate and devastating betrayals. Byzantine history offers some of the most chilling examples of palace coups. The imperial palaces, resplendent with gilded mosaics and marble floors, were no sanctuary for emperors. Generals who had once sworn loyalty would suddenly strike, usurping the throne in the night. In some accounts, emperors were seized while asleep, their guards complicit or powerless against an organized betrayal. Some were blinded, others exiled, some executed before the walls that had once echoed their commands. It was a world where trust was a luxury few could afford, and where survival depended on constant vigilance, cunning, and often sheer luck. Within Western Europe, castles bore witness to similarly brutal power plays. Noble families harbored secret rivalries that could erupt into full-blown insurrections. The Tower of London, a fortress meant to protect the monarchy, became a site of imprisonment, betrayal, and death for those who had fallen out of favor. Courtiers whispered of plots during banquets, secret alliances were forged in dimly lit corridors, and the king's own household staff, those closest in service, sometimes served as instruments of treachery. The line between ally and enemy was perilously thin, and ambition could transform loyalty into lethal conspiracy. Courtiers were often the architects of these coups, their roles a blend of espionage, diplomacy, and manipulation. Chamberlains, ladies-in-waiting, and advisors knew the rhythms of the palace intimately. They understood which doors were unlocked at night, which nobles were disgruntled, and which generals coveted power. Through whispered conversations, carefully placed rumors, and the subtle exploitation of rivalries, these palace insiders could orchestrate the downfall of a ruler without ever drawing a sword themselves. In this theater, perception could be as deadly as action, and deception became a necessary skill for survival. The night itself seemed to conspire with those seeking power. Secret passages, concealed stairwells, and hidden doors allowed conspirators to move unseen, striking where their victim was most vulnerable. Lamps flickered in shadowed halls, their faint light throwing dancing shapes against the walls, perfect cover for stealth and subterfuge. A throne that gleamed in daylight became a target in the dark, the seat of command, a beacon for ambition and greed. Every sigh, every footstep, every closing door could signal imminent danger, transforming the familiar into a maze of uncertainty and fear. Military commanders were equally capable of staging palace coups. Garrisoned soldiers, ostensibly loyal to the crown, could be turned against their liege through bribery, coercion, or promises of reward. Barracks and armories became instruments of betrayal. A king could awaken to find his personal guard complicit in his downfall. In some cases, entire regiments marched upon the very gates meant to defend the ruler, guided by the orders of those who once pledged fealty. The boundaries between civil authority, martial loyalty, and treachery blurred, and the fate of the kingdom often hung on a knife edge. Among the nobility, power struggles were frequently bloodied. Dukes and counts schemed to increase their influence, sometimes challenging the king directly. In the darkness of the night, trusted allies could become adversaries, and familial bonds provided little guarantee of loyalty. Sons might conspire against fathers, nephews against uncles, and brothers against one another. The stakes were nothing less than life and death, not just for the ruler, but for every member of the court caught in the crossfire. Even a minor courtier could tip the balance, their intervention altering the course of dynasties. Assassination, when it occurred, was often swift and brutal. A blade slipped between ribs, a cord tightened in silence, a poisoned goblet offered in trust, all instruments of a strategy meticulously planned and executed. Witnesses were eliminated or intimidated, leaving only whispers and rumors to describe what had transpired. Public displays of power, feigned tranquility, and the performance of daily rituals often masked the violence that lurked just beneath. The castle became a stage where deception, ambition, and blood mingled, crafting stories that would haunt chroniclers for generations. Yet not all coups were sudden or violent. Some unfolded over months or years, with conspirators quietly consolidating power, maneuvering through marriage alliances, and manipulating succession laws. The subtle art of intrigue required patience, planting false reports, isolating rivals, and waiting for moments of weakness. By the time action was taken, the conspirators were well positioned to seize the throne with minimal resistance. Even without swords, these palace machinations could dismantle a king's authority, proving that the pen or the whispered word could be mightier than the sword. The psychological toll on rulers was immense. Living in constant fear of betrayal, they scrutinized friends and family alike, reading every glance, every gesture, every casual remark for hidden meaning. Sleep was fitful. Decisions were fraught with paranoia, and trust was a commodity in short supply. Even the most powerful monarchs could be undone not by armies, but by the quiet conspiracies that festered in their own halls. Life in the castle was a perpetual exercise in vigilant strategy, and the knowledge that any misstep could be fatal. Rebellion often invited reprisals that could be brutal and public. Those who dared to challenge the throne risked execution, mutilation, or permanent exile. Families were stripped of titles, lands confiscated, and loyalists purged in waves of retribution. Yet the history of medieval Europe is replete with examples where audacity succeeded, and a well-timed plot could vault a conspirator into power, rewriting the destiny of kingdoms. Ambition, timing, and cunning dictated outcomes with a precision that rivaled any battlefield maneuver. The castle walls, meant to shelter rulers from external threats, paradoxically became arenas of internal conflict. Thrones were vulnerable guards, complicit, and allegiances fragile. Courtiers, military commanders, and even relatives could become instruments of overthrow. In the stillness of night, ambition took shape as shadows moved through corridors. Plots crystallized in whispered councils, and destiny was altered with the flick of a dagger. The story of the castle is a story of trust, betrayed power, seized, and the ever-present edge of mortality. As night fades and torches gutter in the breeze, the echoes of conspiracies linger. Each stone of the castle seems to remember the plotting, the betrayals, and the blood spilt within. From Byzantine emperors to Western kings, the lesson is enduring absolute power within confined walls invites absolute intrigue. The castle is no longer merely home or fortress. It is both stage and battlefield where loyalty is currency. Trust is fragile, and ambition moves unseen until it strikes. The morning after a coup often revealed a scene of quiet devastation. Chambers once echoing with the commands of a sovereign now lay empty, littered with the traces of a struggle fought in shadows. Broken locks, overturned chairs, and shattered cups bore silent testimony to the violence that had unfolded in secrecy. Outside, courtiers whispered cautiously, measuring loyalty and fear alike, while servants, those witnesses to the intimate horrors of betrayal, moved with hushed steps through corridors where ambition had turned deadly. The castle itself seemed to breathe a tension so palpable it could be felt in every stone. For those who had orchestrated the coup, victory was both intoxicating and precarious. Seizing power within the walls of a fortress required careful timing, ruthless efficiency, and an acute understanding of human psychology. The conspirator's strategy often extended far beyond the immediate act. Allies were rewarded, potential rivals neutralized, and public perception managed with meticulous care. A successful palace coup demanded both brutality and subtlety, an intricate choreography in which one misstep could spell ruin. Power was claimed not merely with a sword, but through mastery of fear, loyalty, and perception. Yet even after the crown had changed hands, the shadow of retribution lingered. Surviving members of the deposed ruler's household posed ongoing threats, whether through secret letters, alliances with foreign powers, or attempts to foment revolt. Every guest, every messenger, every soldier could conceal loyalties to the fallen king. The castle, once a stronghold of authority, now became a battleground of suspicion and vigilance. The new ruler had to move carefully, consolidating power, while anticipating counterplots and ensuring that every corner, every servant, every ally was either loyal or eliminated as a threat. In many cases, the fallout extended beyond the castle walls. Local populations often suffered the consequences of palace intrigue. Villages were pillaged in punitive campaigns. Taxes imposed to fund military loyalty and political purges left communities fractured. Rumors of betrayal and murder spread rapidly, inflaming fear and uncertainty. The aura of instability became a tool for rulers to justify harsher rule, yet also a reminder that even distant lands were entwined with the deadly politics of the court. No corner of a medieval kingdom was untouched by the machinations of its rulers. Some coups, particularly those in Byzantine courts, displayed a theatrical cruelty that was intended to intimidate and demoralize. Emperors and high-ranking nobles were not only deposed but subjected to public punishment, blinding mutilation or ceremonial execution in the palace's inner courtyard. Such acts served both as warning and spectacle, reinforcing the power of those who seized control. Historians recount the fear these events instilled. Even those untouched by the immediate violence were reminded that loyalty was conditional trust, fragile, and power fleeting. Western European courts were no less treacherous. Kings, dukes, and earls often found themselves ensnared in conspiracies hatched by relatives, advisors, or neighboring rulers. The delicate dance of alliances could shift in a single night. Marriages arranged to secure loyalty might fail. Armies promised for support might betray their paymaster, and confidants might trade secrets for survival. In this climate, paranoia became a survival skill. Rulers learned to read gestures, to weigh words, and to anticipate the unspoken motives of those closest to them. Even a fleeting glance could carry the weight of treachery. Intrigue often extended to the ceremonial and sacred. Thrones were seized not only through force, but through manipulation of religious rituals and symbols. Coronations could be interrupted or staged in ways that delegitimized a rival, while priests or bishops were sometimes enlisted to bless the ambitions of conspirators. The line between spiritual authority and political maneuvering was thin, and clerical approval could transform a coup from an act of violence into a seemingly divine transition. The interplay of faith and ambition magnified the psychological power of palace intrigue. Amidst the chaos, personal ambition often collided with familial duty. Brothers turned on brothers. Cousins betrayed cousins, and children of rulers schemed against parents. Ambition did not respect bonds of blood. Indeed, the closer the kinship, the greater the potential for betrayal. In some tragic instances, young heirs were eliminated to secure a throne, their deaths concealed or justified through forged accusations of treachery. The psychological scars of these events rippled through dynasties, shaping the temperament, paranoia, and policies of those who survived, and leaving history steeped in tales of fear and cunning. Despite the darkness, not all coups ended in murder. Some relied solely on intimidation threat of military force or strategic marriages to achieve power shifts. In these cases, the subtle art of persuasion and psychological manipulation determined outcomes. A whispered rumor, a false accusation, or a calculated absence at a critical moment could undermine a ruler's authority without bloodshed. Yet even in these scenarios, fear was the currency of power. Loyalty could be bought, coerced, or feigned, and rulers were ever aware that their position remained perilously conditional. The human cost was immense, extending beyond those who fell in the immediate struggle. Families were fractured, alliances shattered, and entire regions destabilized. Chroniclers of the time noted the pervasive anxiety that followed coups, the way entire courts operated under a veil of suspicion, and how political survival became an ever-present concern. Every act of ambition left echoes, reshaping relationships, governance, and societal structures for decades. The castle, while a symbol of authority, stood also as a monument to human frailty, desire, and cruelty. By nightfall, even those who had achieved victory in a coup often faced the burden of ruling with vigilance. Trust remained scarce. Enemies were plentiful, both overt and hidden. Policies were crafted not merely to govern, but to secure position, to suppress dissent, and to ensure that the fragility of power was never exposed again. Every feast, every council meeting, every ceremonial procession was layered with caution. Even victory demanded careful stewardship. The ruler who failed to anticipate the next threat would quickly find the throne imperiled once more. The tale of the medieval palace coup is one of ambition, skill, and relentless human complexity. It is a story that unfolds within walls of stone, behind tapestries that conceal eyes and ears, across corridors lined with whispers, and through chambers where loyalty is tested daily. Power is both ephemeral and absolute, a prize that drives men and women to extraordinary acts of courage, cunning, and cruelty. In these palaces, history was written not only in treaties and decrees, but in the lives taken and the shadows that fell over thrones. As the candles gutter and the first light of dawn illuminates the battlements, the memory of the night's intrigue lingers. Every stone seems to whisper secrets. Every corridor recalls ambition and betrayal. The castle remains both refuge and trap, protector and executioner. The events of a single night can alter the course of kingdoms, reshape dynasties, and echo through history for centuries. In the world of the medieval palace, the throne is never merely a seat of power. It is the prize of the ambitious, the target of the envious, and the stage upon which the most human of dramas unfolds. In the labyrinthine corridors of medieval castles, where tapestries swayed with draughts and torchlight flickered against cold stone walls, the unseen battle for information raged as fiercely as any battlefield clash. Every whispered conversation, every hurried step in a shadowed hallway could carry secrets that might determine the rise or fall of kings and queens. In this world of perpetual vigilance, the art of espionage was as vital as swords or armor for knowledge precisely controlled, carefully concealed, and strategically revealed. Was itself a weapon of unparalleled power. The medieval court was a complex ecosystem teeming with ambition, loyalty, and fear. Courtiers, advisors, and servants alike moved within a delicate balance of appearance and reality. Behind formal greetings and bowed heads lay networks of observation eyes and ears reporting back to masters who sought an advantage over rivals' relatives and sometimes even their sovereign. Spies were embedded in every layer, some overt in their roles as stewards, chamberlains, or scribes, others concealed as musicians, craftsmen, or wandering clerics. Their task was to gather information, intercept communications, and when necessary, shape perceptions to influence decisions in their patrons' favor. Letters were a lifeline in this shadow war. Missives, wrapped in wax seals, carried coded messages or veiled threats, their contents understood only by those trained to interpret subtle signals. Some couriers memorized information to avoid leaving incriminating evidence. Others employed ingenious devices to encode their words from simple ciphers to complex arrangements of symbols and gestures. A letter intercepted by the wrong hands could mean death, exile, or the unraveling of carefully laid plots. The written word therefore demanded as much caution as the blade, and the ability to read between lines was a skill as prized as a knight's prowess in battle. International intrigue complicated matters further. Kingdoms and principalities were bound together by treaties, marriages, and rivalries, yet these connections were fertile ground for espionage. Ambassadors and envoys often doubled as spies carrying intelligence on troop movements, political unrest, or shifts in allegiance. Merchants ostensibly concerned with trade might report on the economic and military conditions of distant cities, their letters reaching the eyes of rulers hungry for strategic advantage. Even the church, wielding spiritual authority, maintained channels of information, tracking the ambitions and missteps of secular rulers with meticulous attention. Knowledge in this context became the currency of power. Not all spies were men or knights. Women, often underestimated, played crucial roles in the exchange of secrets. Ladies of the court could overhear conversations while presiding over daily rituals or pass information through coded embroidery gifts or whispered words during gatherings. Their position offered both invisibility and influence. The court's attention focused elsewhere while they subtly shaped decisions, warned allies, or undermined rivals. Similarly, servants who moved unseen through chambers and kitchens could relay tidbits of intelligence with devastating consequences. In this way, the machinery of espionage infiltrated the very fabric of courtly life, weaving a web that was both intricate and deadly. Espionage extended into the realm of deception and counterintelligence. False documents were planted to mislead enemies. Rumors were carefully cultivated to destabilize rivals. Even gestures and glances could carry coded meaning. The observant ruler learned to interpret these signs, distinguishing genuine counsel from manipulation, friend from foe. Misreading a gesture could lead to disaster, yet mastery of such subtlety allowed ambitious men and women to ascend courts, secure marriages, or outmaneuver potential assassins. The palace became a chessboard where each player's move was calculated and each reaction anticipated with painstaking precision. Secret rooms, hidden passages, and concealed compartments were as much tools of intelligence as they were for defense. Nobles and kings constructed chambers with false walls, escape routes, and hidden alcoves where sensitive documents could be stored, or meetings held in utter secrecy. Some castles featured tunnels that led beyond the fortress walls, allowing messengers or spies to enter and exit unnoticed. The architecture of power was thus inseparable from the architecture of secrecy. Every stone could bear witness, every hallway could conceal an ear, and every tower could hide a plotting hand. The castle itself became a participant in the game of subterfuge. In some cases, espionage blurred the lines between survival and murder. Informants betrayed kin and companions alike, sometimes at the behest of foreign powers, other times motivated by personal gain or vengeance. Poisoned letters, false accusations, and the sudden disappearance of courtiers were tools of a hidden war fought in silence. Kings and queens learned to trust little beyond the walls of their private chambers, and even within those walls, loyalty was provisional. Paranoia, often justified, guided their every move. Alliances were temporary, and the shadow of betrayal was never far. The consequences of intelligence, or the lack thereof, could alter the course of entire realms. A ruler, misinformed about a rival's army, might march into a trap, while another, warned in secret, could fortify his city and survive a siege that would have otherwise been fatal. Spies influenced wars, marriages, and treaties, often in ways invisible to the chroniclers of the time. The historian's record focused on kings and battles, overlooked the subtle currents of courtly espionage, yet these invisible hands shaped outcomes as decisively as any sword. By evening, the court's layers of secrecy and observation reached a peak. Courtiers returned to private chambers, whispered letters were delivered, and spies filed their reports for the day. The castle, silent in the flickering torchlight, held the accumulated knowledge of power, ambition, and betrayal. Each corridor carried the weight of unseen eyes, each chamber the echo of hushed words. The ruler, aware that a single misstep could be catastrophic, reviewed these fragments of intelligence, piecing together a picture of loyalty, threat, and opportunity. In this shadowed world, survival depended not merely on strength or wealth, but on the mastery of information. Those who learn to manipulate secrets, understand motives, and anticipate the moves of others could rise to power or safeguard their lives. Those who ignored the subtle currents of espionage risked ruin, exile, or death. The medieval court, in all its grandeur and ceremony, was in truth a theater of intelligence, where the unseen often held more sway than the visible, and where knowledge could be as lethal as a dagger hidden in the folds of a robe. The story of spies and secret networks in medieval courts reveals the hidden architecture of power, the interplay of observation, deception, and influence that determined who would live, who would die, and who would hold the throne. The castle's walls, while offering protection, also amplified every whisper and every betrayal, making secrecy a weapon as indispensable as any blade. In the corridors where history was written, the unseen battles of intellect, cunning, and manipulation unfolded with consequences as real and permanent as any battle fought in the open field. Beyond the stone walls of individual castles, the shadows of espionage stretched across kingdoms and principalities, forming a vast invisible web of intrigue that connected rulers, diplomats, and conspirators. A single secret carried from Paris to London, from Castile to the Holy Roman Empire, could shift alliances, ignite wars, or topple dynasties. This international network of spies relied not on armies or fortifications, but on subtlety, patience, and the meticulous cultivation of trust and distrust. Merchants, travelers, and clerics became conduits of information, often without their own knowledge. A merchant returning from Flanders might describe the state of crops, yet within his account lay subtle hints of military readiness, troop movements, or political unrest. Clerics traveling between monasteries might overhear whispered complaints about a king's policies or report the ambitions of a noble family. Each fragment of knowledge collected and interpreted by skilled operatives became a weapon of strategy, allowing rulers to anticipate rebellion, suppress plots, or seize opportunity before rivals even realized it existed. Codes and ciphers flourished in this age of secrecy. Simple substitution ciphers, complex symbol systems, and hidden meanings in mundane correspondence allowed information to cross borders without revealing its true intent. Letters could instruct a duke to move troops or warn a queen of a plot, all disguised in layers of ambiguity accessible only to the intended recipient. The mastery of these coded messages required intelligence, patience, and often the collaboration of trusted scribes who understood the subtle language of deception. A misread cipher could be fatal, yet when employed with skill, it conferred an almost supernatural advantage. Espionage often intersected with diplomacy. Ambassadors ostensibly charged with negotiating treaties or arranging marriages doubled as intelligence gatherers. They observed courtly rituals, listened to private conversations, and reported subtle shifts in alliances. Their dispatches, sometimes encrypted, traveled by courier to the sovereign, influencing decisions that could prevent war or precipitate a coup. A negotiation in Venice, a conversation in Prague, or a feast in Florence all became nodes in a sprawling network of observation and influence, where the unseen hand of spies often shaped outcomes more than banners on a battlefield. Certain rulers developed entire institutions devoted to surveillance. Kings and emperors employed networks of trusted agents, informants in noble households, and secret emissaries who could move unnoticed through cities and courts. The Byzantine Empire, with its intricate bureaucracy, exemplified such an approach. Spies, eunuchs, and advisors collected intelligence to prevent rebellion and maintain control over a sprawling, diverse population. Knowledge of plots, alliances, and military threats was as valuable as gold or grain, and those who controlled information controlled the fate of realms. In some cases, espionage was deadly theater. Agents would plant false intelligence to manipulate rivals into catastrophic decisions. A fabricated letter might suggest that an ally was planning betrayal, prompting preemptive action that eliminated potential threats or sowed chaos in a kingdom. Assassinations often followed a chain of secret signals, coded instructions, and subtle manipulations that masked the perpetrator's involvement. The line between spy and murderer blurred, and history often remembered only the visible consequences, while the silent architects of intrigue remained hidden. The medieval intelligence apparatus also thrived on secrecy within secrecy. Spies monitored other spies, and double agents were common. Nobles might cultivate servants or courtiers who reported to multiple masters, creating layers of uncertainty that protected the instigator while destabilizing rivals. Trust was an elusive commodity, and loyalty was measured in both deeds and perception. Paranoia, often justified, dictated the architecture of courts and the movements of rulers who relied on networks of observation to safeguard both their person and their authority. Technology, rudimentary as it was, played a role in clandestine operations. Hidden compartments in walls, secret doors behind tapestries, and concealed chests allowed sensitive documents to move safely through otherwise exposed spaces. Couriers developed methods to evade surveillance, sometimes carrying messages in hollowed-out objects, disguised scrolls, or sewn into garments. Even simple tools, such as wax seals, carried complex codes. A particular mark or color might signify allegiance, urgency, or caution. The physical environment of the castle and city became an extension of the intelligence network itself, embedding secrecy into stone and timber. Yet espionage was not solely the domain of men. Noblewomen, often underestimated by chroniclers, were pivotal agents of information. Queens and ladies-in-waiting could influence the balance of power without ever leaving their chambers. They interpreted rumors, relayed critical intelligence, and sometimes orchestrated deception to protect their interests or the dynasty. Their actions, subtle, hidden, and often undocumented, demonstrate that influence in medieval courts extended beyond the visible symbols of power, residing also in the quiet mastery of knowledge and perception. The consequences of these secret networks reverberated far beyond individual lives. Wars were won or lost not only by armies, but by timely intelligence. Marriages were arranged or sabotaged based on hidden counsel, and kingdoms shifted their allegiances in response to invisible whispers. The chronicler's eye focused on banners, battles, and proclamations often missed the delicate threads of espionage that ultimately determined outcomes. Yet to those who mastered the silent arts, information was the truest measure of power, and control over it could ensure survival or prompt disaster. By nightfall, the castle, with all its torches extinguished, seemed still, but beneath the apparent calm, the machinery of surveillance continued. Courtiers whispered in secret chambers, letters were passed through hidden corridors, and spies recorded observations in careful silence. Every stone, every corridor, every hallway retained a memory of secrets spoken, of messages exchanged, and of loyalties tested. In this darkness, the ruler's mind worked tirelessly, assembling reports, interpreting subtleties, and attempting to predict the moves of both allies and enemies. The pulse of intrigue was constant, unyielding, and invisible. In understanding the secret networks of medieval courts, one sees that power was never absolute, and authority was never entirely secure. Kings and queens, dukes and bishops, all operated within a framework of observation, manipulation, and intelligence that extended far beyond their immediate control. The visible ceremonies, proclamations, and tournaments were only a portion of the story. Beneath them lay a complex tapestry of covert operations, whispered warnings, and unseen strategies that shaped history in profound ways. In this world, survival depended as much on wit and subtlety as on steel and blood. Ultimately, the networks of spies, informants, and coded correspondence reveal a world in which information itself became a battlefield. The stakes were life and death, crowns and kingdoms, trust and betrayal. The silent agents of this hidden war determined the fates of rulers and the trajectories of nations. And while the chroniclers often left their pens for the visible battles, the story of intelligence, cunning, and the shadowed corridors of intrigue endures, showing that medieval power was as much about what was known and hidden as it was about what was wielded openly on the battlefield. The twilight of medieval courts is a landscape painted in shades of blood and ambition. Castle walls, once symbols of security and grandeur, bear silent witness to decades, sometimes centuries of ambition, treachery, and the quiet accumulation of power at any cost. The air still vibrates with echoes of fallen kings and betrayed nobles, and the corridors seem haunted not by ghosts, but by the choices of men and women who, driven by hunger for dominion, shaped history with every secret and every blade. Here in the dim corridors and shadowed chambers, one begins to understand why thrones were built on bones. The very structure of medieval power demanded vigilance. A king's life was never his own, nor could it ever be, for in the hierarchies of feudal Europe, loyalty was transactional and trust was a commodity in short supply. Every decree, every proclamation, and every marriage alliance carried the potential for betrayal. Ambition crept like ivy along the walls of courts, infiltrating the halls where kings dined and slept, whispering the promise of influence to those clever enough or ruthless enough to seize it. Even the most disciplined ruler, surrounded by the most loyal counselors, could never fully escape the subtle machinations that threatened his reign. The anatomy of power in the medieval world was complex, layered with obligations, fealty, and the ever-present threat of violence. Thrones were secured not only by armies and fortresses, but also by the calculated suppression of rivals. Every lord who commanded loyalty from his vassals, every queen who influenced her husband's choices, every bishop who could sway public opinion through sermon or sanction, became a thread in the intricate web holding the crown aloft. Remove one thread, and the tapestry threatened to unravel. The tension between dependence and dominance, between trust and fear, was the pulse of every royal court. History remembers some of the most notorious acts of treachery, yet even these are fragments of the larger pattern. Kings and queens rose through a combination of cunning opportunity and sheer force. Yet for every well-documented murder, there were countless subtler acts of manipulation, alliances, broken promises, ignored debts recalled at critical moments that shifted the balance of power. These acts, often invisible to chroniclers and even contemporaries, shape the destinies of nations. The threads of conspiracy stretched through generations, and the outcomes of a single night's intrigue could echo for decades. Consider the fates of those who sought the crown through blood. Richard III, often vilified for the disappearance of his nephews, exemplifies the lethal pragmatism that the medieval world demanded. Ivan IV of Russia, whose own son fell victim to his paranoia and wrath, shows the personal cost of unchecked power. Peter the Cruel of Castile, whose reputation for tyranny has passed through centuries, demonstrates how political necessity and cruelty were often indistinguishable. The bones of these rulers' victims, both real and symbolic, are the foundations upon which their legacies were constructed, shaping narratives of fear, authority, and infamy. Yet not all thrones were seized with sword or poison alone. Many rulers ascended through the quiet manipulation of law, marriage, and succession. A well-placed betrothal, a timely alliance, or the strategic use of inheritance could secure power as effectively as any assassination. Even then, the principles of survival were consistent. Maintain loyalty, anticipate betrayal, and when necessary, act decisively. The stakes were eternal. Misjudgment could bring death, exile, or loss of crown. Careful calculation could extend influence for generations. In this, the medieval tyrant was both strategist and predator, constantly balancing ambition with the demands of reality. The physical spaces of power. The great halls, council chambers, and private apartments played a central role in sustaining dominance. Architecture itself reflected hierarchy. Raised thrones, hidden passages, and fortified keeps created both symbolic and practical control. Kings observed, courtiers maneuvered, and servants whispered in the spaces between. In the shadows, spies, informants, and loyal subjects alike participated in the silent orchestration of power. The very design of a palace or fortress became a tool of governance, enabling the sovereign to watch and to act while limiting the exposure to threat. Bloodlines, too, were instruments of authority. Marriage was less a matter of affection than of strategic calculation. Dynastic unions secured claims, cemented alliances, and occasionally masked intentions of betrayal. Children were pawns and heirs, their survival and sometimes demise intertwined with the ambitions of parents and the designs of rivals. The pressure of succession shaped choices, often leading to the very violence that perpetuated cycles of intrigue. Within these familial networks, love, loyalty, and suspicion existed in a fragile balance, a constant reminder that in the medieval court, blood could sanctify a claim as easily as it could stain a hand. Religion provided both legitimacy and leverage. Divine sanction was essential to authority, and rulers invoked God's will to justify both rule and cruelty. At the same time, ecclesiastical power was a weapon. Excommunication, denunciation, and clerical council could destabilize kingdoms supporting conspiracies or undermining sovereigns. The interplay between sacred and secular authority created an environment in which piety and cunning were inseparable. Faith offered both protection and danger, a double-edged sword wielded by kings, queens, and advisors alike. Here again, thrones were built not only on steel and stone, but on perception, ritual, and fear. As night fell upon Europe's courts, the machinery of betrayal remained in constant motion. Advisors plotted in dim chambers, letters coded with hidden meanings traveled under cover of darkness, and alliances shifted like the wind. Even the most loyal servant might harbor ambitions. Even the fiercest warrior might harbor resentment. In this landscape, knowledge equaled power, and silence was often a ruler's greatest ally. Each decision, each whisper, each calculated move carried the weight of consequences that could last generations. Power was never static. It was an ever-changing living force, sustained by both fear and loyalty. The cumulative effect of these forces was profound. Kingdoms rose and fell, not only through battle, but through the subtle architecture of intrigue. The careful manipulation of information, the strategic use of kinship, the orchestration of appearances, and the judicious application of force combined to shape the historical trajectory of Europe. In many cases, the most consequential events were those that went unseen. Whispered instructions, coded messages, and hidden agendas that moved entire nations without the world ever noticing. It was a realm where patience, calculation, and secrecy determined the fate of thrones. Even as chronicles and sagas remember kings and queens for victories or defeats, the invisible networks behind those outcomes often remain obscured. Yet they were essential. The unseen hands of spies, counselors, and agents of influence were the threads holding the tapestry of medieval governance together. The narratives of conquest, betrayal, and succession were inseparable from the meticulous orchestration of information and perception. In these moments, history itself becomes a shadowed mirror, reflecting the interplay between ambition and survival power, and paranoia, loyalty, and treachery. Ultimately, the story of medieval courts is a story of survival at the edge of peril. Thrones were never merely platforms for ceremonial display. They were fortresses of vigilance, arenas of strategy, and instruments of influence. The bones upon which they rested, both literal and metaphorical, remind us that every crown carried a cost, every symbol of authority a shadow of threat. The echoes of these centuries resonate still in the structures that remain in the chronicles that endure, and in the tales of intrigue that continue to captivate those who seek to understand the human desire for power. The great halls, now silent, still seem to hum with memory. Shadows stretch across stone floors where kings once tread cautiously, where nobles whispered, and where servants carried secrets with trembling hands. Every throne tells a story of ambition. Every corridor, a narrative of careful observation and subtle maneuvering. And in understanding this architecture of power, one sees clearly that medieval life, for all its pomp and ceremony, was also a continuous negotiation with danger, an intricate dance of survival in a world where loyalty was fleeting, betrayal inevitable, and the legacy of blood eternal. As the corridors of power grow colder, with the passing centuries, the stories of medieval courts remain vivid in the mind's eye, tales of ambition, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of authority. Thrones, however grand, were fragile constructs resting upon a foundation of human desire, fear, and mortality. Each ruler, each conspirator, each victim contributed to a tapestry woven from both strategy and blood, creating a world in which survival was the highest art and power, its most perilous prize. To understand why medieval courts were so perilously violent, one must look beyond the spectacle of execution and battlefield. It was the very nature of hierarchical society, where land lineage and loyalty dictated fortune, that cultivated an environment ripe for betrayal. A king's authority was simultaneously absolute and precarious. His word carried weight, yet it could be challenged at any moment by an ambitious noble, a scheming sibling, or a powerful cleric. The pursuit of power demanded constant vigilance, and any lapse could prove fatal. The stories that survive the deaths by poison the blade hidden beneath a cloak, the plots unraveling in candlelit chambers, reveal only a fraction of the reality. Often, it was subtlety, patience, and the ability to manipulate perception that determined the fates of rulers and subjects alike. A carefully placed rumor could topple a dynasty. A moment of trust misplaced could end a reign. In this delicate balance, the stakes were not only crowns and castles, but life itself. Each choice, each negotiation carried consequences that could echo for generations. Consider the rulers whose names history has not forgotten for cruelty or cunning. Richard III, whose path to the throne is still debated, symbolizes both the allure and the danger of unchecked ambition. Ivan the Terrible, haunted by paranoia and grief, exemplifies how fear could twist paternal love into lethal force. Peter the Cruel of Castile, whose ruthlessness extended to family and court alike, reminds us that the pursuit of power often demanded a suspension of morality. In every case, the throne was a prize won at immense personal and political cost, and the shadow of death lingered constantly over both the powerful and the powerless. Yet the story of medieval tyranny is not only one of horror, it is a study in human psychology, societal structure, and the mechanics of influence. Kings and queens, advisors and clerics, all operated within a framework of expectation and obligation. The constraints of faith, tradition, and law shaped actions as much as personal ambition. The delicate negotiation between ruler and ruled, between sovereign and subject, created a tension that defined courtly life. Betrayal was never random. It was calculated, often inevitable, and always consequential. The lessons of these courts extend beyond the medieval period, offering insight into the dynamics of power across time. Ambition, unchecked by accountability, fosters fear, suspicion, and oppression. Loyalty without understanding is fragile, easily redirected by promises or threats. And the pursuit of authority, when divorced from justice or compassion, leaves a legacy of suffering that endures long after crowns have fallen. Thrones built on bones are more than historical curiosities. They are warnings, cautionary tales etched into the collective memory of nations. Architecture, too, played a subtle but essential role in sustaining power. The design of castles, the placement of chambers, the construction of secret passages and observation points. These were as much instruments of control as armies or decrees. In the shadows of stone walls, plots were hatched, alliances forged, and threats neutralized. Each corridor became a theater of strategy, each hall a stage where perception and reality intermingled. The physical spaces of power were inseparable from the psychological pressures they imposed, creating an environment where vigilance was constant and safety illusory. Religious influence cannot be understated. Kings invoked divine sanction to legitimize their rule, while bishops, abbots, and popes wielded spiritual authority as a political tool. Excommunication, interdiction, and religious censure were not mere threats. They were instruments of coercion, capable of undermining monarchs and empowering conspirators. Faith and fear intertwined, reinforcing the fragile equilibrium of the court. The spiritual realm became a silent partner in the orchestration of power, offering both protection and peril in equal measure. As dynasties rose and fell, the cycle of ambition and betrayal repeated with relentless consistency. Bloodlines, succession disputes, and the pressure of inheritance created inevitable tension within families. Brothers turned on brothers, uncles on nephews, queens on kings. Even the most carefully planned reigns were subject to the unpredictable currents of human desire. And while chronicles often celebrated victory or mourned defeat, they rarely captured the depth of intrigue, the whispered secrets, and the subtle manipulations that determined the fate of kingdoms. By the final decades of the medieval era, the lessons of past treachery informed both rulers and subjects. The echoes of assassination, rebellion, and conspiracy shaped diplomatic norms, succession laws, and courtly conduct. Even as weapons and armor evolved, the fundamental challenge remained the same. Maintain authority, anticipate betrayal, and navigate a world where trust was provisional and power contested at every turn. Thrones continued to be symbols of ultimate authority, but always at the cost of vigilance, cunning, and sometimes morality. And so, as we stand in the ruins of castles, walk the halls of preserved palaces, and read the chronicles of chroniclers long gone, the truth is stark and undeniable. Medieval thrones were built upon human ambition, fear, and death. The bones of the past lie beneath the stone floors, whispering lessons about the nature of power and the consequences of its pursuit. To rule was to risk everything. To betray was to participate in the eternal calculus of survival. In this, the story of medieval courts transcends time, offering insight into the perennial human struggle with authority and desire. For those who would gaze upon history with curiosity, there is both fascination and warning. The rise and fall of tyrants, the intricacies of palace intrigue, and the countless acts of courage, treachery, and strategy demonstrate that power is never absolute, loyalty never guaranteed, and security always provisional. Every crown, every scepter, every throne carries the shadow of all who opposed, plotted, and fell along the way. And the bones of these men and women, whether remembered or forgotten, form the silent foundation upon which Europe was built. Thrones built on bones remind us that human ambition is timeless, that power comes at a price, and that the pursuit of authority is inseparable from the potential for betrayal. Even now, the echoes of medieval intrigue resonate in the structures, stories, and lessons inherited by modern Europe. And while the swords have rusted and the poison bottles shattered, the human drama remains eternal and compelling. As the final echoes of footsteps fade from the stone corridors and the flickering torchlight dims upon the cold walls of long-abandoned castles, we are reminded of the world we have traversed together. a world where ambition clashed with loyalty, and where every crown was forged in blood and shadow. The stories of medieval courts are more than tales of kings and queens. They are mirrors of human desire, fear, and the fragile boundaries between trust and treachery. Thrones were won and lost, not merely with armies, but with whispers, secrets, and the precise orchestration of human hearts. Through the labyrinth of plots, betrayals, and deadly ambition, we have glimpsed the intimate and terrifying lives of those who ruled. From the whispered conspiracies in dimly lit chambers to the violent upheavals that reshaped entire kingdoms, every act of courage or cruelty shaped the destiny of nations. It is a testament to the paradox of power. To possess it is to be constantly threatened by it, and to wield it is to live under its shadow, always aware that a single misstep could topple a dynasty. Yet, in the midst of fear and bloodshed, the human stories remain vivid. The kings haunted by suspicion, the queens navigating labyrinthine politics, the brothers and sisters torn between love and ambition. These were people who lived, laughed, plotted, and wept, bound together by the forces of heritage, faith, and the relentless quest for authority. And though centuries have passed, their choices continue to echo through history, influencing the politics, culture, and even our understanding of power today. As we close the doors on these medieval halls and leave the candles to gutter in silence, remember that history is not just a record of victories or defeats. It is a tapestry woven from the lives of all who dared to grasp for power and from those who fell beneath its weight. The intrigue, the bloodshed, the ambition, they are reminders of the cost of authority and of the enduring human fascination with the perilous heights of influence. If this journey through shadowed halls, secret plots, and the bones upon which thrones were built has captivated your imagination, remember to share these stories. Like, subscribe, and continue exploring history with us, for there are countless corridors still waiting to reveal their secrets. And as you reflect on the past, perhaps you will glimpse the same patterns that continue to shape the world, reminding us that the dance of power and betrayal is as eternal as the stones themselves.